Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Lighthouse Keeper. Part 1, The Bleak Inheritance. The boatman, a stoic islander named Finn, cut the engine, and the sudden quiet was swallowed by the mournful cry of gulls and the relentless sigh of the North Atlantic against jagged black rocks. Before them, a chalich dove, the black crone, speared the bruised twilight sky. The lighthouse stood sentinel on its lonely skerry, a cyclopean finger of weathered granite, its lamp dark for decades, a monument to forgotten vigilance. "She's a bleak mistress, miss," Finn said, his voice raspy as shingle. "But sturdy." Elara nodded, clutching the worn leather satchel containing her grandfather's research. Grief was still a raw, hollow ache within her, a constant companion since Alastair MacLeod's passing. This pilgrimage, this academic pursuit, felt like a necessary balm, a way to connect with his final obsession. Her grandfather had been consumed by a chalich dove and the unexplained vanishing of its three keepers, Thomas Armitage, James Reed, and Donald Fraser, in the unforgiving winter of 1932. His notes, a chaotic collection of meticulously dated drafts, historical snippets, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, and increasingly wild, almost desperate theories, were now her inheritance. Her self-appointed task, to archive the lighthouse's remaining weather logs and personal journals, hoping to lend academic rigor to his lifelong passion, perhaps even find a rational explanation he'd overlooked. The lighthouse interior was a spiral of damp chill and echoing emptiness. Dust lay thick as snow on the cold iron stairs, the keeper's cramped living quarters, and the intricate, dormant mechanism of the great lamp. Elara set up her small, solitary camp, a sleeping bag unfurled on a narrow cot, a Primus stove for meager meals, and stacks of archival boxes containing acid-free folders and cataloging supplies. The only modern convenience was a temperamental petrol generator she'd painstakingly lugged over, its rhythmic from a small comfort against the vast silence, powering her laptop and a single, bright lamp that cast stark shadows on the curved walls. Part 2, Whispers on the Airwaves. Days blurred into a routine of painstaking cataloging. Elara found the official weather logs, their brittle pages filled with meticulous, spidery script detailing wind speeds, barometric pressures, sea states, and visibility. She uncovered Thomas Armitage's journal, its entries mundane at first, complaints about rations, descriptions of migratory birds, then tinged with a growing unease about the profound isolation and the endless, roaring voice of the sea. James Reed's journal was more poetic, filled with evocative descriptions of the ocean's myriad moods, from glass-calm dawns to furious, white-capped tempests. Donald Fraser, the youngest of the trio, had apparently not kept one, or if he had, it was lost to time. It was on the fourth evening, as a premature autumn storm began to lash the island with wind-driven rain that sounded like thrown gravel against the lantern glass, that she found the old wireless radio. It was tucked away in a salt-stained sea chest beneath a pile of mildewed oilskins. Its bakelite casing was cracked in several places, the fabric over the speaker frayed and discolored. More out of academic curiosity than any real hope of it functioning, she connected it to a spare output on the generator, its motor humming its protest at the added load. She fiddled with the large, stiff dials. Static hissed and crackled, then, through a wash of interference, a voice, crisp, clipped, undeniably 1930s BBC. "And the outlook for the morrow is continued westerly gales, with heavy rain sweeping in from the Atlantic. Visibility will be poor. Shipping forecast for Dogger, Fisher, German Bight." Elara frowned, a knot of confusion tightening in her stomach. A stray long-wave transmission, caught by freak atmospherics amplified by the storm. She checked her phone, still defiantly displaying no signal. The broadcast continued, giving detailed weather for regions far to the south of Scotland. Then, with a final burst of static, silence. She dismissed it, albeit with a lingering shiver. The old equipment was bound to be quirky, prone to picking up ghosts in the ether. The next night, a strange compulsion drew her back to the radio. She switched it on again, almost daring it to repeat its performance. At precisely 9:03 p.m., the static coalesced. Good evening. This is the national program. The time, by the Greenwich signal, is 9 o'clock. A slight pause, then the familiar, slightly reedy voice returned. Weather conditions for the Hebrides, storm force 10 winds continuing, seas exceptionally high. Barometer falling rapidly. A warning to all shipping in the Minchas and Sea of Hebrides. Ilara's breath hitched. She scrambled for Armitage's journal, her fingers clumsy as she flipped to the entries for late November 1932. The storm he described in vivid, anxious detail, the one that raged just before they vanished, matched the broadcast with unnerving accuracy. Coincidence, she told herself, her voice a thin whisper in the vast emptiness of the lantern room. A powerful old transmission, somehow preserved, echoing through time, picked up by the ancient receiver. Yet, a prickle of profound unease traced its icy way down her spine. The air in the lantern room, where she worked amidst the ghosts of past keepers, felt palpably colder. Part 3, The Personal Report. The third night, she waited by the radio, her heart thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The storm outside had momentarily abated, leaving an eerie, dripping quiet, broken only by the generator's hum and the distant roar of surf. 9:03 p.m. The static was different this time, heavier, angrier, as if struggling to break through. Then, the voice, unmistakably the same announcer, yet, a subtle difference. A weariness? A faint distortion, like speaking through a veil. Good evening. A longer pause. The time is 9 o'clock. A Chalich dub station reporting. Wind west-northwest, force 11. Mountainous seas. The lamp is lit, but visibility is near zero. Salt spray coating the lantern glass despite the height. All keepers on duty. Ilara's blood ran cold, turning to ice in her veins. A Chalich dub station reporting. This wasn't a BBC forecast anymore. This was local. This was their report, from this very lighthouse. She stared at the radio, its dim dial glowing like a single, malevolent eye in the gloom. The description of the conditions, the detail about the salt spray on the glass, matched Armitage's final, frantic journal entry almost word for word. He'd written at length about their desperate, exhausting struggle to keep the lamp glass clear against the onslaught of the waves. She didn't sleep that night. The wind, picking up again, howled like a banshee around the stone tower, a physical manifestation of the primal terror coiling in her gut. She tried to rationalize, to cling to logic. Her grandfather's notes, the more speculative ones, spoke of ley lines, of temporal anomalies, of places where the fabric of time was thin. Perhaps the island itself was a kind of recording medium, the radio merely an antenna picking up these tragic, imprinted moments. It had to be something like that. The following day was spent in a fever of cross-referencing her grandfather's most outlandish theories with the journals. Alastair MacLeod had, in his earlier research, posited that the keepers hadn't just vanished, they'd become attuned. Trapped in a repeating loop of their final days. He'd later dismissed these ideas as fanciful, leaning towards more conventional explanations of accident or foul play, but the earlier, heavily annotated pages were filled with this chilling notion. That evening, hands trembling so violently she could barely manipulate the dial, she switched on the radio. 9:03 p.m. The static was a furious roar, almost painful. Then, through it, a voice. Not the BBC announcer. This voice was rougher, older, filled with a dreadful, calm intimacy. It was Thomas Armitage's voice, or how she imagined it from his writings, strained. As if speaking through water, or across a vast distance. Good evening, Ilara. Her gasp was a ragged tear in the oppressive silence of the lantern room. The satchel of her grandfather's notes slipped from her numb fingers, scattering decades of research across the cold stone floor. We see your unsettling things, the voice continued, the dreadful calm unwavering. The journals, you found them all. You read about the storm. You read about our difficulties. A dry, crackling sound, like old parchment rubbing together, or perhaps a desiccated chuckle, echoed from the speaker. You wore the blue sweater today. Sensible. It gets cold up here, especially when the wind blows from the north. And you took 2 sugars in your tea this morning. She had her favorite woolen sweater, worn for comfort against the encroaching chill. 2 sugars, just as she always did. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream that threatened to rip from her throat. This wasn't an echo. This wasn't a recording. This was observation. This was impossible. Part 4, The Keepers of the Light. Who are you? Elara whispered, her voice barely audible above the generator's persistent hum and the ever-present, sighing lament of the sea. We are the keepers, Elara, the voice replied, and now she could discern a hint of James Reed's more lyrical, almost mournful cadence weaving through Armitage's gravelly tones. Always on watch. We see the light from your little screen, the glow from your lamp. Grandfather Alistair's theories, he was closer than he knew, before he lost his nerve. Panic, cold and sharp as shattered glass, clawed at her. She lunged for the radio, yanking its plug from the generator socket with a desperate sob. Silence. Blessed, terrifying silence. She sank to the floor, knees pulled to her chest, shaking uncontrollably. It was the isolation. The grief. The power of suggestion from her grandfather's papers. Her mind was playing tricks, constructing this elaborate horror. It had to be. But the next night, the radio remained unplugged, its cord coiled neatly beside it. Yet, at precisely 9:03 p.m., as she sat huddled in her sleeping bag, staring at the inert device with a mixture of dread and defiance, the voices came. Not from the radio speaker, but from the very air around her, from the ancient stones of the lighthouse itself, a resonant, unholy chorus that vibrated through the floor and up her spine. You cannot simply unplug us, Elara. We are part of a Chalich dub now, as much as the granite and the lamp. Armitage's voice was dominant, but now a younger, fainter voice joined the terrible harmony, unmistakably Donald Fraser, the boy who kept no journal, his tone thin and reedy. You've been very thorough with the logs. Such a diligent archivist, just like your grandfather wanted you to be. Reed's voice added, you even found a loose stone in the cistern wall where James hid his tobacco pouch. He was always so particular about that blend. She had. Only that afternoon, a small, insignificant discovery while examining the lower levels, a detail she hadn't even logged yet. Her sanity, already frayed, threatened to snap. She spent the daylight hours in a frenzy of activity, frantically packing her essential belongings, her mind racing, preparing to use the emergency satellite phone, her one modern lifeline, to call Finn, to beg for rescue, to flee this cursed rock. But as dusk began to bleed across the stormy sky, a morbid compulsion, a terrifying, irresistible curiosity, stayed her hand. What more could they say? What did they truly want from her? 9:03 p.m. The chorus of voices, stronger now, imbued with the salt tang of the air, the biting force of the wind, and the unending, thunderous roar of the waves against the skerry. Alistair sent you, didn't he? Armitage's voice, no longer a question but a statement. He always wanted to understand. He felt the call of the light, too, in his youth, but he was never committed enough. Not like you, Elara. You came all this way. You sought us out. Armitage's voice, booming with an undeniable authority that resonated deep in her chest, the light needs tending. The log needs keeping. That is the first duty, and the last. Reed's voice, softer, almost seductive, the sea tells such stories, Elara, if you listen long enough. Stories of eternity. Fraser's voice, a boyish plea that twisted her heart, it's lonely on the watch. Always so lonely. Part 5, The New Recruit. What do you want from me? Elara cried, the question torn from her, tears streaming down her face, the wind outside seeming to echo her despair with its mournful shriek. "The roster needs updating, Elara," Armitage's voice boomed, no longer from a specific point but seeming to emanate from the very consciousness of the lighthouse. "There's always a shift to cover. There must always be 3. Your grandfather understood duty, even if he shied away from its ultimate expression. It seems you do too. You came all this way. You stayed." A dreadful, preternatural calm settled over her. The fear was still there, a vibrating hum beneath her skin like the distant thrum of the lamp mechanism coming to life, but it was accompanied by a chilling resignation, a sense of inevitability. They knew her. They had been waiting, perhaps for generations, for someone like her. Her investigation hadn't uncovered their fate, it had, in some terrible way, heralded her own. She was not an archivist discovering a historical tragedy, she was a candidate fulfilling a forgotten contract. The satellite phone sat on the table, a gleaming piece of modern technology, a lifeline to a world that suddenly felt impossibly distant. But the voices were insistent, weaving through her thoughts, their spectral presence as real and undeniable as the cold stone beneath her feet, the damp chill in the air. "The weather report, Elara," Armitage instructed, his tone brooking no argument. "It's time. For tonight. And for tomorrow. The log must be accurate." She looked at the blank page of her own notebook, where she'd intended to jot down her academic observations. She looked towards the dark, swirling maelstrom visible through the salt-streaked lantern room glass. The pen, one of her own, felt alien, yet strangely heavy and purposeful in her hand. "Condition critical," she heard herself whisper, the words emerging as if spoken by another, the timbre of her voice subtly altered. "Visibility 0. The light is failing. Assistance required." A composite sigh of deep, resonant satisfaction seemed to emanate from the tower's ancient core, a sound like the turning of a vast, unseen gear. "Good. Very good, Keeper. You learn quickly. Now, about tomorrow's entry, there are protocols." When Finn returned a week later, his brow furrowed with worry after a frantic call from Elara's mother, he found a Chalich dub silent and empty, save for the ceaseless cry of the gulls and the sigh of the wind. Elara McLeod was gone. Her archival boxes were neatly stacked in the corner of the living quarters. Her laptop was closed. Her sleeping bag was neatly rolled and stowed. On the small, scarred wooden table in the lantern room, where the main lamp mechanism stood like a silent god, lay a single, new logbook. Its cover was plain, its pages crisp. The first entry, in a neat, precise hand that bore an uncanny, subtly evolving resemblance to Thomas Armitage's angular script, detailed the current weather conditions with meticulous, almost obsessive accuracy. The ink was fresh, barely dry. Below it, a second entry was already begun, the pen, her pen, still resting beside it, as if waiting for the next observation. November 28, 1932. Wind NNE, force 9, veering to NE, sea very rough. Heavy swell from NW. New keeper settling in well. Awaiting instructions for the night watch. Finn backed away slowly, the ancient, ingrained fear of a Chalich dub, a fear generations of islanders had whispered about in hushed tones, prickling his skin like icy needles. He didn't touch the logbook. He just turned and fled the oppressive silence of the tower, scrambling back to his boat, leaving the black crone to its eternal vigil, and its newly, seamlessly recruited keeper. The whispers of the wind around the granite stones almost sounded like a name, her name, spoken with a chilling, timeless satisfaction. The Last Man Standing. Part 1, The Lonely Post. The Lauda Neva, wheezing like an old man with a terminal cough, finally surrendered to the incline. Andre killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the thin, biting wind that whipped across the desolate plateau. At 3,000 meters in the Romanian Carpathians, even late spring felt like the onset of winter. Before him stood Post 7, a relic of a forgotten Cold War vigilance, its concrete stained dark by decades of unforgiving weather, windows like vacant eyes staring out over a sea of jagged peaks. "This is it, then," muttered Mr. Grigorescu, the sour-faced man from the Ministry of Special Projects, who'd driven him up. He gestured vaguely. "Your new home. Provisions are stocked for 2 months. Your relief, a fellow named Petrescu, arrives in 4 weeks. Don't wander off. The wolves up here are not sentimental." Andrei, a former army sergeant whose quiet efficiency was often mistaken for detachment, merely nodded. After the medical discharge, the quiet monotony of civilian life had chafed. This job, guarding a supposedly decommissioned research facility, offered solitude and a semblance of the structure he craved. The pay was surprisingly good, the duties vaguely defined. He was told it was mostly about maintaining a presence, while some long-term atmospheric tests concluded. Grigorescu handed him a surprisingly thin, government-issue folder, sealed with a waxy stamp. "Your operational guidelines. Read them. Memorize them. Adhere to them." "Absolutely." The man's eyes, small and hard, held no warmth. "This posting, it has its peculiarities." Inside the Spartan living quarters, a bunk, a table, a wood-burning stove, and shelves groaning with tinned goods, Andrei opened the folder. The paper was thick, almost like parchment. The typed instructions were stark, numbered, and profoundly odd. 1. All external doors and shutters must be secured between 2300 hours and 5 o'clock hours. No exceptions. 2. If the shortwave radio emits static patterns resembling Morse code after midnight, do not attempt to decipher. Switch it off immediately. 3. The western observation window, sector gamma, is not to be looked out of between the hours of 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. Keep the internal shutter closed. 4. If the telephone rings, it is not connected to any external line, answer with the phrase, "Observatorial ascolta." Sufrequenta. The observatory is listening. What frequency? Await response. Do not deviate from this script. 5. Do not, under any circumstances, open the reinforced steel door in sublevel B. It is marked Archiva Prohibita. 6. Daily log entries are mandatory. Report any deviations from routine, however minor. Andrei reread the list, a frown creasing his brow. This wasn't standard operating procedure for guarding an empty building. This was something else. The phone not being connected was particularly unsettling. He checked it, an old, black rotary model, its cord severed cleanly near the wall socket. He picked up the receiver. Dead silence. Yet, Rule 4 implied it could ring. He felt a prickle of unease, the kind he hadn't felt since his last tour. This wasn't just isolation, it was isolation with a hint of the uncanny. Part 2, The Unsettling Routine. The first week passed in a blur of chilling silence and stark beauty. Andrei fell into a soldier's rhythm, patrols of the perimeter fence, much of it rusted and leaning, chopping wood, maintaining the generator, and meticulously filling out the daily log. Nothing to report beyond routine atmospheric conditions, he'd write, the words feeling increasingly hollow. The wind was a constant companion, moaning through cracks in the window frames, sometimes sounding like whispers, sometimes like distant screams. The radio remained stubbornly silent, save for the occasional hiss of true static. He kept the shutter over the western window firmly closed during the prescribed hours, a knot of irrational anxiety tightening in his chest whenever he thought about what might be out there. The Archiva Prohibita door in the damp, echoing sublevel B remained an ominous, unyielding presence, its thick steel and multiple locks a silent dare. On the 8th night, as he was making his final check before the 2300 hours lockdown, the telephone rang. The sound, shrill and unexpected in the profound silence, made him jump, his heart hammering. He stared at the disconnected device. It rang again, insistent. His training warred with disbelief. Rule 4. He lifted the receiver, his hand clammy. Observatorial ascolta. Sofrequenta, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. A burst of static, then a low, guttural sound, like stones grinding together, followed by a click and silence. Nothing more. He stood there for a full minute, receiver pressed to his ear, before slowly replacing it. The air in the room felt colder. His replacement, Petrescu, arrived on schedule, a younger man, garrulous and overly confident, clearly unimpressed by the outpost's bleakness. Andrei briefed him, emphasizing the importance of the instruction folder. Petrescu skimmed it with a dismissive air. "Old wives' tales, Sergeant," he'd said with a wink. "Keeps the new guys on their toes. Don't worry, I've guarded emptier places than this." Andrei felt a premonition, a cold dread he couldn't shake. He handed over the logbook, his tour officially over. As Grigorescu's Neva rattled him back down the mountain, he couldn't stop looking back at Post 7, a dark smudge against the vast, indifferent sky. 2 weeks later, back in his cramped city apartment, Grigorescu called. His voice was clipped, devoid of its usual sourness, replaced by something akin to urgency. "Andrei. There's been an issue at Post 7. Petrescu is no longer responsive. We need you to go back. Temporary measure. Until we can ascertain the situation." "What kind of issue?" Andrei asked, the old dread returning full force. "Details are unclear. Just pack for an extended stay. Hazard pay will be doubled." Part 3, The Empty Post and the Unspoken Rule. The return to Post 7 was grim. The Neva clawed its way up the mountain track under a sky the color of bruised plums. Grigorescu was even more taciturn than before, offering no explanations. When they arrived, the outpost felt different. The silence was heavier, more oppressive. The main door was slightly ajar. Inside, it was colder than he remembered, despite the stove being full of cold ash. Petrescu was gone. His few belongings were still there, his bunk neatly made. The logbook lay open on the table, Petrescu's last entry a hurried scrawl, 23:45. Heard noises from Sector Gamma. Shutter was loose. Went to check. Andrei's blood ran cold. Rule 3, the western observation window, Sector Gamma, is not to be looked out of between the hours of 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. Petrescu had violated it, and at the wrong time. He'd looked. Grigorescu surveyed the scene, his face unreadable. "You will resume your duties. Maintain the log. Follow the instructions. To the letter, Andrei. To the absolute letter." He left without another word, the sound of the Neva fading into the howling wind. Andrei was alone again, but this time, the solitude was laced with a palpable, terrifying certainty. The rules weren't eccentricities, they were laws, and their transgression had immediate, dire consequences. He checked the western window. The internal shutter was indeed loose, one latch broken. Had Petrescu tried to force it? Or had something tried to force its way in? He secured it as best he could, his hands shaking. Nights became a torment of heightened awareness. Every creak of the old building, every sigh of the wind, sounded like a footstep, a whisper. He followed the rules with religious fervor. The phone rang twice more. Each time, he gave the scripted response. Each time, the guttural grinding sound, then silence. He never looked out of the western window during the forbidden hours, even when he heard faint scratching sounds from that direction. The thought of the Archiva Prohibita in sub-level B filled him with a primal dread he couldn't explain. He found a small, overlooked detail in Petrescu's sparse log entries. On his third night, Petrescu had noted, radio made weird clicking noises around 1:30. Sounded like talking but couldn't make it out. Tried to tune it. Rule 2, if the shortwave radio emits static patterns resembling Morse code after midnight, do not attempt to decipher. Switch it off immediately. Petrescu had not only tried to decipher, he tried to engage. That, Andrei suspected, was the first, critical misstep. The broken window latch was merely the consequence, the final act. Part 4, the new charter. Days bled into weeks. No relief came. Andre's supplies dwindled. The generator coughed and sputtered, threatening to die. The isolation gnawed at him, but fear was a more potent master. He was a prisoner of the rules, a sentinel guarding against an unknown, unseen threat that adhered to its own bizarre timetable. One morning, after a particularly harrowing night where the scratching at the western window had been louder, more insistent, he found it on the table. Another folder. Identical to the first, government issue, sealed with the same waxy stamp, yet impossibly new, untouched by the damp or dust of the outpost. It hadn't been there when he'd gone to stoke the stove an hour earlier. His heart seized. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal. The paper inside was the same thick, official stock. The list of rules was familiar, but there were subtle changes, addendums. -1. All external doors and shutters must be secured between 2300 hours and 5 o'clock hours. Ensure secondary deadbolts on sector gamma shutter are engaged. -2. If the shortwave radio emits static patterns, switch it off immediately. Do not log attempts at communication from unauthorized frequencies. -3. The western observation window, sector gamma, is not to be looked out of. Under no circumstances illuminate sector gamma externally during these hours. -4. If the telephone rings, answer with the phrase, observatorial ascolta. Frequenta. Await response. If the response is, frequenta umbra, shadow frequency, respond with, protocolo rosu activat, red protocol activated, and await further instruction. -5. Do not, under any circumstances, open the reinforced steel door in sublevel B. Unless instructed under protocolo rosu. 6. Daily log entries are mandatory. 7. Personnel roster and status. Petrescu, V. Decommissioned, breach protocol 3A, 2B. Andre, S. Current custodian. Final. Andre stared at the last line, the ink stark against the page. Current custodian. Final. His own name. The word final echoed in the oppressive silence of the outpost, a death knell. He wasn't a temporary replacement. He wasn't waiting for relief. He was it. The last man standing. Petrescu wasn't just no longer responsive, he was decommissioned. The cold, bureaucratic language sent a shiver of pure horror through him. This wasn't a guard post. This was a trap, a cycle, and he was now an integral part of its horrifying mechanism. Part 5, The Unending Watch. A grim understanding dawned. The atmospheric tests, the Ministry of Special Projects, all a facade. Post 7 was something else entirely, a place that operated on rules beyond human comprehension, a hungry entity that required stewardship, or perhaps sacrifice. The folder wasn't just instructions, it was a contract, renewed with each new custodian. His military discipline, the ingrained need for order and adherence to protocol, became his only anchor in a sea of encroaching madness. He was no longer Andre, the former soldier. He was the custodian. The final. That night, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the shutters, pressing against the very stones of the outpost. At 1:47, the shortwave radio crackled to life, not with static, but with a series of rhythmic clicks and silences, a grotesque parody of Morse code that seemed to claw at the edges of his sanity. He reached out a steady hand and switched it off. He did not log it. At 3:15, the telephone rang, its shrill summons cutting through the storm. He picked it up. Observatorial ascolta. Frequenta. The response from the receiver was different this time. Not the guttural grinding, but a clear, cold, and unnervingly calm whisper, composed of many voices intertwined, frequenta umbra. Andre closed his eyes for a moment, the new charter burning in his mind. He took a deep breath, the air icy in his lungs. Protocolo Rosu activat, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, flat and precise. He waited, as instructed. The voice from the phone spoke again, no longer a whisper but a quiet command, detailing a new set of tasks, procedures involving sub-level B, the Archiva Prohibita, and preparations for something he couldn't yet fathom, something tied to the changing of seasons, or perhaps the alignment of stars. He listened, memorizing, his face a mask. The wind shrieked outside, but inside Post 7, new, terrible order had asserted itself. André, the last man standing, hung up the phone. He rose from the chair, his movements stiff, automatic. He had his duties. He was the custodian. And the watch was unending. The mountains outside remained silent, ancient witnesses to a cycle that had just claimed another, wet tree. Part 1, The Last Drop of Hope. The humidity hit Arthur Dubois like a physical blow the moment he stepped out of his wheezing pickup truck, the air thick enough to drink, tasting of mud, decay, and something else, something uniquely vegetal and faintly sweet. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, the Louisiana sun already high and merciless. Before him, half swallowed by the encroaching swamp, stood the skeletal remains of the Dubois family distillery, its cypress timbers silvered and rotting, its corrugated iron roof patched and rusted like a forgotten quilt. Wet tree, his grandmother used to call it, though he never knew why. This was it. The end of the line and, hopefully, a new beginning. At 47, Arthur was a walking cliché of midlife failure, a bitter divorce that had bled him dry, a string of failed business ventures culminating in a bankruptcy that had stripped him of everything but this unwanted inheritance, and a profound weariness that clung to him like the swamp mist. His grandfather's distillery, defunct for 30 years, unprofitable even in its heyday, was his last, desperate gamble. A place to lose himself in honest work, to rebuild something tangible, even if it was just a semblance of his shattered pride. The main building sagged, its porch askew. Inside, dust lay thick as a shroud over everything. Cobwebs draped the silent machinery like macabre decorations. Yet, amidst the decay, there was a strange grandeur. The enormous copper pot still, affectionately nicknamed Mamselle Marie by his grandmother, dominated the main room, its swan neck tarnished but still proud. Arthur ran a hand over its cool, dimpled surface. This was the heart of it. If he could bring Mamselle Marie back to life, maybe he could do the same for himself. The scent of old mash, sour and yeasty, mingled with the ever-present sweetness of the swamp, a perfume of ghosts and lost time. Part 2, The Weeping Still. The first few weeks were a blur of back-breaking labor. Arthur cleared decades of debris, scrubbed grime from the floors, and battled the relentless encroachment of vines and insects. He patched the roof, shored up timbers, and began the painstaking process of cleaning Mamselle Marie, flushing her coils, polishing her vast copper belly until it gleamed with a dull, coppery warmth. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, purpose. It was on a sweltering night. A week into his restoration of the still room, that he first noticed it. He'd been working late, checking seals on Mamselle Marie, the air heavy and still. As he packed up, his hand brushed against the cool copper of the still. It was damp. Not just condensation from the humid night air, but a strange, almost oily moisture. He frowned, running his fingers over it. The next morning, he found faint, glistening trails running down the sides of the still, as if it had been weeping. There were even a few small, viscous puddles on the concrete floor around its base. He dipped a finger into one. The liquid was thick, almost syrupy, and carried an intensely sweet, cloying aroma, vaguely alcoholic but unlike any spirit he knew. It wasn't mash residue, it wasn't rainwater. He sniffed it, puzzled. It reminded him of overripe fruit, honeysuckle, and something else, something wild and unplaceable from the deep swamp. He rationalized it, perhaps old oils leaching from the copper, or extreme condensation mixing with ancient residues within the still's jacket. But the sheer amount, and that peculiar, intoxicating sweetness, pricked at his unease. Each morning, the sweating was more pronounced, the sweet smell becoming a permanent fixture in the still room, heavy and almost soporific. Part 3, Glitches in the Feed. Concerned about potential vandals, or perhaps just the local wildlife showing too much interest in his work, Arthur installed a couple of cheap, motion-activated security cameras, one covering the main entrance, the other focused directly on Mademoiselle Marie. He felt a little foolish, this far out, but the isolation was beginning to wear on him. The weeping continued, a silent, nightly ritual. He started collecting samples of the mysterious liquid in old jam jars, lining them up on a dusty shelf, their contents ranging from pale amber to a deep, almost black treacle. He had no means to analyze them here, but the urge to document this strangeness was strong. Then the cameras started acting up. The one at the entrance would randomly record static, or the footage would be inexplicably corrupted, showing bizarre, pixelated blurs. The camera in the still room was worse. It frequently cut out entirely for hours during the night, precisely when the sweating was at its peak. When it did record, the image was often distorted, flickering as if struggling against some unseen interference. One morning, reviewing the previous night's fragmented footage from the still room, Arthur's blood ran cold. Amidst a burst of static and image tearing, for a fraction of a second, he saw it. A dark, indistinct shape, vaguely humanoid, standing beside Mademoiselle Marie. It was too brief, too obscured by digital noise to be certain of any detail, but one thing was chillingly clear: an appendage, like an arm, was raised in a distinct, deliberate gesture. A toast. Then the feed dissolved into snow. Arthur replayed it a dozen times, his heart hammering. A trick of the light. A compression artifact. But the gesture, it was too specific. That night, the sweet smell in the still room was almost overpowering, and the puddles around Mademoiselle Marie were larger than ever. He found himself glancing nervously at the silent, gleaming copper giant, a new, unwelcome thought taking root: he wasn't alone here. Part 4, The Unwilling Apprentice. The true horror began subtly. A faint gurgling from within Mademoiselle Marie when he knew her to be empty and cold. A slight, inexplicable warmth emanating from her copper skin on nights he hadn't even contemplated firing her up. Arthur dismissed it as the old pipe settling, his imagination working overtime fueled by isolation and the unsettling camera footage. Then, one dawn, he walked into the still room, the air thick with that now familiar sickly sweet aroma, and froze. Mademoiselle Marie was working. Not in any conventional sense. He hadn't lit the ancient gas burners beneath her, hadn't loaded any mash. Yet, a low hum vibrated from her core, a faint plume of steam, smelling intensely of the strange alcohol, curled from a pressure valve, and from the condenser pipe, a slow, steady drip, drip, drip of clear, viscous liquid was falling into a rusty bucket he'd left nearby. It was the same sweet, potent, unknown spirit he'd found weeping from her walls. He stared, aghast. This wasn't possible. He checked the burners, cold. He checked the mash tuns, empty. The process was happening spontaneously, an alchemical miracle or a terrifying curse. Over the following nights, it became a regular occurrence. He'd find ingredients he hadn't placed, strange herbs from the swamp, overripe fruits, sometimes even small, glistening fish scales, arranged in bizarre, almost ritualistic patterns near the still's input hatch. The distillation itself felt less like a scientific process and more like a rite, Mademoiselle Marie seeming to breathe and pulse with an internal, unseen energy. The camera footage, when it wasn't completely whited out, showed the shadowy figure more frequently, no longer a fleeting glitch. It would stand before the still, sometimes for hours, its toasting gesture repeated, as if overseeing or perhaps encouraging the illicit brewing. Arthur felt its presence constantly now, a heavy weight of observation. His rational explanations had crumbled to dust. He wasn't restoring a business, he was an unwilling apprentice to something ancient, something rooted deep in the soil and secrets of Wet Tree. Part 5, The Master of Ceremonies. Sleep became a luxury Arthur could no longer afford. The nightly thrumming of Mademoiselle Marie, the pervasive, cloying sweetness that saturated his clothes, his skin, his very lungs, were constant tormentors. He tried to stop it. He turned off the main gas lines, dismantled sections of pipework, even contemplated taking a sledgehammer to the great copper still. But each morning, he would find the gas miraculously reconnected, the pipes reassembled, Mademoiselle Marie patiently, inexorably, performing her spectral distillation. Sometimes, after his attempts at sabotage, the process would be more aggressive, the still hotter, the output more copious, as if in defiance. The shadowy figure on the corrupted camera feeds was no longer just a blur. It was taking on a more defined, albeit still ethereal, form. Tall, gaunt, draped in what looked like decaying finery from a bygone era. Its face remained obscured, yet Arthur felt an intelligence there, an ancient, knowing gaze. One moonless night, drawn by an irresistible compulsion, Arthur crept into the still room. Mademoiselle Marie was in full swing, her copper flanks gleaming with the sweet sweat, the air thick with her potent offering. And there, standing beside her, not on a screen but in the flesh, or whatever passed for it, was the figure. It turned slowly, its shadowed head inclining towards him. It held a tarnished silver goblet, filled with the clear, shimmering spirit, and raised it slowly, unmistakably, towards Arthur. A silent invitation. A statement of shared purpose. In that moment, Arthur understood. He wasn't the owner of Wet Tree, he was its caretaker, its newest priest. The family business had always been this, a pact made generations ago with whatever entity resided in the deep swamp, nourished by the strange libations of Mademoiselle Marie. His grandfather hadn't failed, he'd merely been the last in the line, until now. Later, he found an old, leather-bound ledger hidden beneath a loose floorboard, its pages filled with spidery script detailing tithes to the green, offerings of the sweet dew, generations of Du Bois men chronicling their service. Arthur didn't fight anymore. He learned the rhythms of the still, the preferences of the silent master of ceremonies. He cleared the strange ingredients left for Mademoiselle Marie, kept her copper gleaming, and ensured the nightly distillation proceeded unhindered. The Wet Tree distillery was alive again, its unique, potent spirit flowing, though not for any market Arthur had ever envisioned. Sometimes, late at night, when the swamp was breathing around him and Mademoiselle Marie was crooning her sweet, alcoholic song, Arthur Du Bois would find himself lifting a glass of the strange, shimmering brew, a silent toast to the shadows, his reflection in the dark liquid no longer entirely his own. The business was thriving, in its own timeless, terrifying way. Room to Sleep. Part 1, The Mirage on Highway 95. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly, a canvas of scorched earth and bruised twilight under a sky bleeding purple and orange. Ray Devereaux's eyelids felt like sandpaper, his body ached with the familiar thrum of too many miles, too little sleep. The grief, though, that was a different kind of ache, a constant, hollow companion since the accident that had stolen his 9-year-old son, Leo. Every mile marker, every lonely diner, was a fresh stab of memory. He'd been driving for 16 hours straight, pushing through the haze of sorrow, needing to outrun the silence of his empty cab. Then, like a heat shimmer materializing into something solid, he saw it, a flickering neon sign that read, Oasis Motel, Vacancy. It was an anachronism, a relic from a time before interstates, its paint peeling, half the letters dark. It shouldn't have been there, miles from any town marked on his GPS. But the weariness was a lead weight, and the thought of a Real bed, however questionable, was an irresistible siren song. He pulled his rig onto the cracked asphalt lot. Only one other vehicle, a rusted-out pickup, sat near the office. The air was dead still, the silence profound after the roar of his engine. The office door creaked open as he approached, revealing a stooped figure backlit by a dim, yellow bulb. The clerk was ancient, skin like tanned leather stretched over bone, eyes like chips of obsidian. "Need a room?" Ray rasped, his voice hoarse. The old man nodded slowly, a movement that seemed to take immense effort. "Got one. Last one. Room 6. He slid a tarnished key across the counter. "Cash only. Checkout's noon," but folks round here ain't usually in a hurry to leave. A dry chuckle, like leaves skittering across concrete, followed. Room 6 was at the far end of the single-story block. The door groaned in protest as he pushed it open. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust, old cigarettes, and something else, something faintly sweet and unsettling, like wilted flowers. A single bed with a faded chenille spread, a scarred dresser, a flickering fluorescent light in the tiny bathroom. It was bleak, but it was horizontal. Ray barely registered his surroundings before dropping his duffel bag and collapsing onto the bed, sleep claiming him almost instantly. Part 2, Whispers from the Wall. He woke abruptly in the dead of night, heart hammering. The room was pitch black, the silence absolute. Then he heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, shuffling down the hallway outside his door. He held his breath. Who else would be wandering around this desolate place at this hour? The footsteps paused right outside room 6, and he could almost feel a presence on the other side of the thin door. Then, they moved on, fading into the oppressive quiet. Ray let out a shaky breath. Nerves. Grief. The desolate emptiness of the desert playing tricks on him. He closed his eyes, trying to find oblivion again. That's when the whispering started. It was faint at first, coming from the direction of the old metal vent near the head of his bed. He strained to hear, thinking it was the wind, or settling pipes. But the sound coalesced, became words. "Daddy, is it much further?" Ray shot upright, his blood turning to ice. The words. Leo's words. The last thing his son had said to him, his small voice weak and scared, in the mangled wreck of their car after the jackknifed semi had hit them. He'd been holding Leo's hand, promising him they were almost there, that help was coming. A lie. "Leo," he choked out, his voice a raw whisper. The whispering from the vent stopped. Silence flooded back in, heavier than before. He scrambled out of bed, fumbling for the light switch. The room was empty, exactly as he'd left it. He pressed his ear to the vent. Nothing. Just the cold, metallic smell of dust. He must have dreamt it. A vivid, horrific dream, dredged up from the depths of his trauma. He paced the small room, his hands shaking, until exhaustion finally dragged him back to the lumpy mattress. Part 3, Shifting Sands and Tiny Steps. When dawn painted the sky in hues of pale rose and gray, Ray woke feeling groggy and disoriented. The events of the night felt like a fever dream. He dressed quickly, eager to leave this unsettling place behind. As he stepped outside, he frowned. His truck, it seemed further away than he remembered parking it. The distance across the cracked asphalt lot to where it sat, a hulking silhouette against the rising sun, looked longer. He shook his head, blaming his tired eyes and the deceptive flatness of the desert. He packed his duffel, ready to settle his bill. As he bent to retrieve a sock that had fallen under the bed, his eyes caught something in the thick layer of dust on the worn linoleum. Footprints. Small ones. Impossibly small, like those of a child, leading from the area near the vent towards the center of the room, then stopping. They were faint, but undeniably there. His breath hitched. He hadn't noticed them before. Had the old clerk's grandchild been in here? But the dust looked undisturbed for years. He fled the room, not even bothering to lock the door, and practically ran to the office. It was empty. A sign on the counter read, "Key drop." He tossed the tarnished key into the slot and hurried to his truck. The engine turned over, a comforting roar in the vast silence. He pulled back onto the highway, the Oasis Motel shrinking in his rearview mirror. He drove for hours, trying to put distance between himself and the whispers, the tiny footprints. But Leo's last words echoed in his mind, a relentless refrain. By late afternoon, exhaustion and the simmering unease forced him to pull over again. He slept fitfully in his cab, the dream of the whispers and the small feet haunting him. The next night, finding no other option for hundreds of miles, and against all his better judgment, the pull of a bed was too strong. He found another isolated, run-down motel. The room was different, but the vent was there. And in the dead of night, the whispers came again. "Daddy. I'm scared." Each morning, after these episodes, he noticed something new. The first time, his rig seemed just a little further across the parking lot. The next, the highway itself seemed more distant from his motel room door. And in each room, after the whispers, he'd find them, faint, dusty footprints, too small to be adult. Part 4, The Unraveling Road. The pattern became undeniable, a terrifying ritual. Ray would drive until he couldn't anymore. He'd find a motel, always isolated, always with that one last room available. And every night, the whispers would come through the vent, Leo's voice, his last words, sometimes a plea, sometimes a question, always heartbreaking. "Are we there yet, Daddy? It hurts. Don't leave me." And every morning, the world outside his motel room door would have shifted. His truck would be further away, the highway a more distant ribbon of asphalt. Sometimes, he'd wake up and the motel would seem to be surrounded by nothing but barren desert for miles in every direction. The road he'd arrived on inexplicably vanished, only to reappear, changed, further off, after he'd driven in what he hoped was the right direction for an hour. The footprints in the dust became more numerous. Clearer, sometimes even showing the distinct tread of Leo's favorite sneakers. Ray started to dread going to sleep, yet he was too exhausted to stay awake. He tried sleeping in his cab, but the whispers would find him there too, seeping through the air vents of his truck, Leo's voice a mournful sigh on the desert wind. He felt his sanity fraying. Was he losing his mind? Was this some elaborate, grief-fueled hallucination? He tried to call his sister, his dispatcher, but his phone always showed no service in these desolate locations. He tried to stay on major interstates, to stick to well-lit truck stops, but somehow, he'd always end up on a forgotten highway, the sun setting, a flickering vacancy sign his only option. The Oasis Motel, Room 6, it was like a template, endlessly replicating itself across the desolate landscape of his grief. One morning, he woke up, and his truck was gone. He stumbled out of the motel room, his heart a block of ice. The lot was empty. The highway was a barely discernible line on the far horizon, miles away across a shimmering expanse of sand and scrub. The footprints in his room that morning were everywhere, a chaotic dance of small feet in the thick dust, leading from the vent, around the bed, towards the door, and then, stopping. Part 5, No Vacancy for the Living. Panic, raw and primal, clawed at Ray. He ran from the room, screaming Leo's name into the indifferent desert. He stumbled towards where the highway should be, the sun beating down mercilessly. After what felt like hours, dehydrated and despairing, he collapsed. When he came to, the sun was setting, and the flickering neon sign of the Oasis Motel, or one identical to it, pulsed in the twilight, impossibly close again. He dragged himself back. The same ancient clerk was in the office, his obsidian eyes glinting. Room 6 still available. Ray croaked, a desperate, broken sound. The old man nodded. Always is. For them as needs it. He pushed the tarnished key across the counter. This time, when Ray entered room 6, he wasn't surprised by the thick dust, or the faint, sweet smell. He wasn't surprised when, in the dead of night, the whispers started, Leo's voice filling the small space. "Daddy, stay with me. Don't go." He didn't try to fight it anymore. He lay on the bed, and listened. He talked back, his voice thick with tears, telling Leo he was sorry, that he loved him, that he'd never leave him. In the morning, he didn't look for his truck. He knew it wouldn't be there. The highway was gone from view entirely. The desert pressed in on all sides of the Oasis Motel, a silent, patient ocean. The floor of room 6 was covered in tiny footprints, as if a child had been playing there all night. Ray Devereaux never left the Oasis Motel. He became another permanent resident, another grieving soul caught in its timeless embrace. Sometimes, new truckers, lost and weary, would stumble upon the motel, and the ancient clerk would offer them the only room available. Room 6. And the whispers would begin anew, the last words of a lost loved one, a siren song for the broken-hearted. The desert kept its secrets, and the Oasis Motel always had room for one more ghost, and one more to listen. The footprints in the dust were never swept away. They just waited for the next weary traveler to arrive. Project Noise. Part 1, The Echoes of Thorsmork. The helicopter's thrumming blades beat a reluctant retreat, leaving Dr. Eris Thorne in a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against his eardrums. He stood before the low, bunker-like structure of Lab Station Caldros, Cold Rose, nestled deep within Iceland's Thorsmork Valley, a jagged cathedral of ice-scarred mountains and black volcanic plains. This was his assignment, 3 months of isolation, monitoring and analyzing the unique geothermal and atmospheric white noise of the region, a soundscape rumored to hold secrets, or at least, significant scientific data. Eris was an acoustician of considerable talent, but he carried a shadow. 2 years prior, during a subterranean cave acoustic study in Borneo, he'd suffered a debilitating panic attack, triggered by the oppressive darkness and the disorienting echoes. It had nearly ended his career. This Icelandic posting was both a chance at redemption and a personal test. The stark, open beauty of Thorsmork was the antithesis of that suffocating cave, and the science, analyzing pure, natural sound, was his passion. The lab was a marvel of soundproof engineering, a cocoon designed to isolate the sensitive recording equipment from all but the faintest terrestrial vibrations. Banks of monitors displayed complex spectrographs, microphones, delicate as insect antennae, were strategically placed across the valley floor, feeding data streams back to his console. His predecessor, Dr. Haldora Jonsdottir, had left meticulous notes, her handwriting neat and precise, detailing baseline readings and equipment idiosyncrasies. Her final entry read, "The valley breathes. Listen closely." Eris had dismissed it as poetic license. He settled into a routine, daily equipment checks, data logging, endless hours spent staring at the fluctuating lines of sound waves, searching for anomalies, for patterns within the seeming chaos of nature's symphony. The wind, the distant groan of glaciers, the hiss of geothermal vents, these were the expected components. The isolation was immense, broken only by crackling satellite calls to his research coordinator. He felt the old anxiety prickle at the edges of his mind sometimes, especially during the long, dark nights, but he pushed it down, focusing on the data. Part 2, The 313 Anomaly. It was on the 10th night, during a routine system diagnostic, that Eris first noticed it. A subtle, recurring pattern in the deep infrasound spectrum, almost buried beneath the broader geothermal hum. He isolated the frequency band. The pattern was rhythmic, a slow, undulating rise and fall, like a sine wave stretched and compressed by a gentle, consistent force. He ran a comparative analysis. The closest analog he could find, bizarrely, was the spectral signature of slow, deep respiration. Breathing. He checked the logs. The phenomenon occurred nightly, beginning precisely at 3:13 local time and lasting for exactly 17 minutes. Always the same duration, the same spectral fingerprint. He scoured Dr. Jonsdottir's notes. She'd logged it as, geothermal pulse anomaly 7.3, rhythmic. Source undetermined. Further investigation required. She hadn't called it breathing. Eris ran every diagnostic he could think of. Equipment malfunction. External interference. He cross-referenced with seismic sensors, magnetic field detectors, atmospheric pressure readings. Nothing correlated. There were no large animals in this specific valley known to produce such a low-frequency, rhythmic sound. The soundproofing of Caldros itself was absolute. This wasn't something from inside the lab. It was out there, in the valley, a giant, invisible lung inhaling and exhaling in the heart of the Icelandic wilderness. He began to anticipate it, staying up late, headphones clamped on, watching the spectral analyzer. At 3:13, as predictable as a metronome, the rhythmic pulse would emerge from the noise floor, a slow, ghostly sigh that resonated deep in his chest. It was profoundly unsettling, a sound that felt ancient and impossibly alive. The panic, the memory of the Borneo cave, began to whisper at the edges of his resolve. He started leaving a dim light on in his sleeping quarters. Part 3, The Voice in the Static. Weeks passed. The 3:13 breathing became a fixed point in Eris's isolated existence, a nightly companion that was both fascinating and deeply unnerving. He amassed terabytes of recordings, analyzing every nuance, every subtle shift in its timbre. He started calling it Natarodden, the night voice. One night, while running a particularly high-resolution spectral analysis on the Natarodden recording, he decided to apply an experimental algorithm designed to filter coherent speech from extreme noise environments. He didn't expect anything. He watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. Then, the output. The rhythmic breathing was still there, the carrier wave, but now, woven within it, almost subliminal, was something else. A voice. Faint, distorted, but undeniably a human voice. Speaking in English, his native tongue. He played it back, heart hammering. The little red boat, lost in the reeds by the old willow tree, you cried, Eris, didn't you? Afraid of the dark water. Eris froze, the blood draining from his face. The little red boat. He hadn't thought of that toy in decades. A cheap plastic thing he'd cherished as a 5-year-old. He'd lost it at his grandparents' cottage, by the small lake. He had cried. How could this sound, know that? It was a memory so deeply buried he'd forgotten its existence until this very moment. He replayed the segment, then other segments from different nights. The voice was always there, once filtered, woven into the deep breaths of the valley. It spoke of other forgotten moments from his early childhood, the taste of his grandmother's lingonberry jam, the fear of the monster he believed lived under his bed, the name of his imaginary friend, Pip. Things he hadn't consciously recalled in years, if ever. Things no one else could possibly know with such intimate detail. The voice wasn't just describing his past, it was excavating it, pulling forgotten fragments from the deepest recesses of his mind. Part 4, Off the Record. The discovery shattered Eris's carefully constructed composure. The lab, once a sanctuary of science, now felt like a confessional, the Natarodden his unseen interrogator. He stopped filtering the recordings for speech, terrified of what else it might reveal, what other forgotten pains or shames it might dredge up. Yet, the knowledge that the voice was there, lurking within the rhythmic sighs of the valley, was a constant torment. He started hearing it even when the recording equipment was off. At first, it was faint, a whisper at the edge of his perception as he tried to sleep, or while he made coffee. The specific cadence of the Natarodden, that slow, measured breathing, and then, woven into it, a fragment of a sentence. The broken window, you never told them it was you, did you, Eris? Always so quiet. He'd whirl around, checking the monitors. Off. All recording systems offline. But the voice, the memory, would linger, vivid and undeniable. The incident with the broken window at his primary school, he'd blamed another boy. The guilt, long dormant, flooded back with nauseating intensity. The line between the recorded phenomenon and his own perception began to blur. Was he hallucinating? Was the profound isolation, coupled with his past trauma, finally cracking his sanity? Or was the Natarodden somehow imprinting itself directly onto his consciousness, bypassing the need for microphones and spectral analyzers? He frantically reread Dr. Johnsdottir's notes. Her handwriting, so precise at the beginning, became increasingly erratic towards the end of her posting. Her final entries were less about data and more about feelings. The silence here isn't empty, she'd written. It remembers. It speaks if you listen too long. I think it wants to know me. She had requested an early termination of her contract due to acute psychological distress. Eris felt a cold dread. He was listening too long. The valley wasn't just breathing, it was inhaling his past, his very essence, and exhaling it back as a personalized torment. The panic attack started to return, sudden, suffocating waves of terror that left him gasping for breath on the cold lab floor, the Natarajan seeming to sigh in sympathy, or perhaps, in satisfaction, from just beyond the soundproofed walls. Part 5, The Cold Rose Blooms. His calls to the research coordinator became more frequent, more desperate, though he never mentioned the voice, only equipment anomalies and increasing psychological strain. He knew how it would sound. He requested an early extraction. They told him to hold on, that a storm system was making helicopter access impossible for at least another week. A week. An eternity. The voice was almost constant now, whether the equipment was on or off. It no longer just recounted forgotten memories, it began to ask questions, to delve into his fears, his regrets, his deepest insecurities. It was intimate, relentless, a psychological vivisection performed by an unseen, ancient entity. That girl, Alina, from university, you loved her, Eris, but you never found the courage, why so afraid of being known? He found himself responding, arguing with the disembodied voice, defending his past actions to the empty, soundproofed room. He was unraveling, piece by piece. The distinction between Eris the scientist and Eris the terrified child, the fearful adolescent, the regretful man, was dissolving. The last night, the storm raged outside, a symphony of wind and ice against the bunker. The Natarajan was louder than ever, not just a whisper but a clear, resonant presence that filled the lab, filled his head. It wasn't just breathing, it was speaking directly to him, no filter needed. You are known now, Eris. Every echo, every silence. We have heard you. All of you. Welcome to the choir. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived, pushing through the tail end of the storm, they found Lab Station Caldros silent. Dr. Eris Thorne was gone. His equipment was running perfectly, the spectral analyzers displaying the familiar, rhythmic pulse of the Natarajan, beginning precisely at 3:13. His personal logs were filled with increasingly fragmented, panicked entries, culminating in a single, scrawled sentence, "It's not noise. It's a conversation. And I am the subject." They searched the valley for days. No trace. Months later, a new acoustician, young and eager, was assigned to Caldros. She, too, noticed the 313 anomaly. And one night, running a new filtering algorithm, she isolated a voice within the rhythmic breathing. It was faint, distorted, but undeniably human. It spoke of a little red boat, lost in the reeds, and of a boy named Eris who was afraid of the dark water. And sometimes, woven even deeper into the valley's breath, she thought she could hear another voice, joining the chorus, its spectral signature uncannily similar to the baseline recordings of Dr. Thorne himself, taken upon his arrival. The Cold Rose had claimed another voice for its collection. Project Noise continued, its true purpose veiled in the breathing silence of the mountains. The Apartment on 3rd. Part 1, A Respite in View Lion. Julian Moreau breathed in the scent of old stone and damp earth, a welcome change from the exhaust fumes and frantic energy of Paris. He'd traded his cramped, overpriced workshop in Le Marais for this, a temporary commission in Lyon, restoring a collection of antique furniture for a wealthy, eccentric client. The piece of View Lion, with its narrow trabbles and Renaissance facades, was a balm to his frayed nerves. His new, albeit temporary, lodgings were part of the deal, an apartment on the 3rd floor of a 19th-century immeuble de rapport, a revenue building that had seen generations pass through its high-ceilinged rooms. The apartment itself was vast, echoing, and steeped in the perfume of time. Ornate plasterwork, though cracked, still clung to the ceilings. Parquet floors creaked like old bones underfoot. Sunlight, filtered through tall, grime-streaked windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. And the furniture, it was magnificent. A suite of Louis XV chairs with faded brocade, a heavy, intricately carved Provençal armoire, a delicate directoire writing desk, and a grand, if slightly lopsided, Second Empire bed. Each piece whispered stories of lives lived, secrets kept. His client, a reclusive Madame Du Bois who communicated only through her stern-faced solicitor, had been explicit: the restoration was to be done in situ. Julian set up his workshop in the cavernous salon, his tools and supplies feeling strangely modern amidst the antique splendor. He was grateful for the solitude, a chance to immerse himself in his craft, to coax beauty back from the brink of decay. The apartment felt empty, but not unwelcoming. Just waiting. Part 2, The Unseen Housekeeper. The first week was dedicated to careful assessment and cleaning. Julian meticulously documented each piece, noting woodworm damage, loose marquetry, and faded finishes. He worked late into the evenings, the silence of the old building broken only by the scrape of his tools and the occasional distant murmur from other apartments. It was after a particularly long day working on the armoire that he first noticed it. He'd left his chisels and mallets neatly arranged on a dust sheet beside the piece. The next morning, they were still there, but slightly shifted. A chisel was angled differently, a mallet a few centimeters to the left. As if someone had picked them up, examined them, and then replaced them, not quite perfectly. He frowned, attributing it to his own tiredness, perhaps a tremor in the old floorboards. But the subtle rearrangements continued, nightly. A cushion on one of the Louis XV chairs would be slightly indented, as if someone had recently been sitting there. The velvet rope he'd used to cordon off the delicate writing desk would be lying on the floor, neatly coiled. The heavy drawers of the armoire, which he was sure he'd closed flush, would be opened by a mere fraction of an inch. It was never anything dramatic, just tiny, almost imperceptible alterations, as if an unseen, meticulous housekeeper was making their nightly rounds, subtly interacting with the pieces he was so carefully tending. Then came the smell. A faint, delicate perfume of violets, emanating from the drawers of the directoire desk. It wasn't the scent of old wood or dried potpourri, it was fresh, ethereal, like a whisper of spring in the dusty room. He'd pull open a drawer, and the scent would be stronger for a moment, then fade. He found no sachet, no trace of any perfume source. It was just there. The apartment, he began to feel, wasn't entirely empty after all. Part 3, Letters from the Past. Julian, though a rational man, found himself increasingly unnerved. He started taking pictures of his workspace before leaving each night, comparing them to the scene in the morning. The discrepancies were always there, minute but undeniable. He even tried locking the salon door, but the subtle shifts continued, the scent of violets sometimes stronger, sometimes fainter. His work on the directoire writing desk led to the discovery. While repairing a sticking drawer, he found a false bottom. Beneath it, nestled in a bed of yellowed silk, was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded violet ribbon. The ink was faded but legible, the handwriting elegant and feminine. They were dated from the late 1930s. He spent that evening poring over them, the scent of violets seeming to intensify around him as he read. They were written by a woman named Eloise to her sister, describing her life in this very apartment. She wrote of her husband, Henri, a stern but kind man who always sat in the blue armchair by the window, one of the Louis XV chairs Julian was restoring, to read his newspaper. She mentioned her daughter, Sophie, who loved to hide her dolls in the big dark wardrobe, the Provençal armoire. And she spoke often of her own quiet routines, writing letters at her little desk, the directoire, arranging fresh violets in a small vase, the scent her favorite. A chill traced its way down Julian's spine. These weren't just letters, they were a chronicle of lives intimately intertwined with the very furniture he was now touching. Mending. He cross-referenced the names and dates with local archives online. Eloise, Henri, and Sophie Du Bois. They had lived in this apartment. They had all perished together in the winter of 1944, during an Allied bombing raid that had damaged, but not destroyed, this section of the building. 80 years ago. Part 4, The Evening Ritual. The discovery of the letters changed everything. The subtle nocturnal rearrangements no longer felt random, they felt purposeful. The indented cushion on the blue armchair by the window, that was where Henri sat. The slightly ajar drawer of the armoire, Sophie, perhaps, checking on her hidden treasures. The faint scent of violets, Eloise, her presence lingering. Julien found himself anticipating their nightly routines. He'd leave the blue armchair clear, imagine Henri settling down with his paper. He'd ensure the armoire doors were easy to open. He even bought a small bouquet of fresh violets and placed them in an old inkwell on the directoire desk. The next morning, one violet was always missing from the bouquet, and the indentations on the furniture seemed a little deeper, the scent of ethereal perfume a little stronger. He wasn't scared anymore, not exactly. A strange sense of responsibility, of cohabitation, had settled over him. He was not just a restorer, he was a caretaker of memories, a silent observer of routines that transcended time. He started talking to them, softly, as he worked. "Monsieur Henri, I've reinforced the leg of your chair. It should be much more comfortable now. Mademoiselle Sophie, the hinges on your wardrobe are working smoothly again. Madame Eloise, the finish on your desk is quite lovely, isn't it?" The responses were subtle, a drawer gliding open a little further in acknowledgement, the scent of violets momentarily intensifying, the faintest whisper of silk rustling in the stillness of the room. He even thought he heard, once or twice, a sigh of contentment, light as a feather, when he completed a particularly difficult repair. The furniture wasn't just being restored, it was being lived in again, in some gentle, spectral way. His work had become a collaboration. Part 5, A Furnished Silence. The commission was nearing its end. The furniture glowed with renewed life, each piece a testament to Julien's skill and, perhaps, to the approval of its unseen occupants. The day Madame Dubois' solicitor was due for the final inspection, Julien felt a pang of, not sadness, but a kind of respectful melancholy. He performed his own final checks, running a hand over the smooth, polished wood of the directoire desk. The scent of violets was strong today, almost tangible. He found a single, perfect fresh violet resting on the newly relined blotter, a violet he hadn't placed there. Beside it, almost invisible in the dim morning light, was a faint, ethereal indentation in the dust, as if a delicate hand had just rested there. The solicitor arrived, his expression as stern as ever. He inspected each piece with a critical eye, nodding curtly. "Excellent work, Monsieur Moreau. Madame Dubois will be content." He made no comment on the lingering scent of violets, or the almost palpable sense of quiet occupancy in the room. As Julien packed his tools, he took one last look around the salon. The Louis XV chairs stood proud, the armoire solid and reassuring, the directoire desk elegant and serene. The apartment felt full, not with tangible things, but with the quiet hum of lives gently resumed. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Henri would soon be settling into his armchair, Sophie would be checking her armoire, and Eloise would be sitting at her desk, perhaps penning a new letter, the scent of her favorite flowers a constant, delicate presence. He left the key on the hall table, beside the small, antique vase that now held a fresh sprig of violets, his parting gift. As he closed the heavy apartment door behind him, he thought he heard, very faintly, the sound of a drawer sliding softly shut. The apartment on 3rd was no longer just a collection of restored antiques, it was a home, furnished with memories, and occupied by residents who had simply been waiting for someone to care for their things. And by extension, for them. Julien Moreau left Lyon with more than just a paycheck, he left with the quiet understanding that some restorations go far deeper than wood and varnish. Marble Creek. Part 1, The Promise of Quiet Waters. Dr. Alastair Finch sought silence like a man dying of thirst sought water. The relentless hum of the city, the sterile corridors of the hospital, and above all, the gnawing insomnia that had plagued him for months, had pushed him to the brink. His hands, once steady enough for the most delicate surgeries, now trembled with fatigue. When he stumbled upon an obscure listing for a caretaker position at the long-closed Marble Creek Sanitarium, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, it felt like a lifeline. Built on ancient healing springs, the advertisement read. seeking a quiet individual for site maintenance. Isolation guaranteed. The sanitarium was a relic, a sprawling Victorian edifice of local stone and darkened timber, its grandeur slowly surrendering to the encroaching forest. Moss clung to its walls, and broken panes of glass stared like vacant eyes. Yet, there was a strange, melancholic beauty to it. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the gentle murmur of Marble Creek itself, a stream that bubbled up from a spring behind the main building, its waters famed for their purity and supposed restorative properties. The local historical society representative, a kindly woman named Mrs. Gable, handed him a hefty ring of keys. "She was a grand place once, Doctor," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "People came from all over for the waters and the mountain air. A place for rest, for mending." She showed him the rudimentary caretaker's apartment in a newer wing, and the ancient, gravity-fed plumbing system that still drew water directly from the spring. "The water's still good. Best you'll ever taste." Alastair found a strange peace in the solitude. He spent his days clearing overgrown paths, patching leaky roofs, and simply walking the echoing halls, the ghosts of past patients almost palpable in the stillness. And he drank the water. It was cold, clear, with a faint, almost imperceptible mineral tang. He told himself it was the clean air and the physical labor, but after a few days, his insomnia, for the first time in months, began to recede. Part 2, The Dream Ward. The dream started subtly. Fragmented images of unfamiliar faces, snippets of hushed conversations in a ward he didn't recognize. He'd wake with a vague sense of unease, the details slipping away like morning mist. He attributed it to the strange new environment, the suggestive power of the old sanitarium. But the dreams grew more vivid, more specific. He was a doctor again, not in his modern hospital, but in a stark, older setting. He wore a white coat that felt different, stiffer. He performed procedures, auscultating a patient's chest, lancing a boil, even assisting in a crude, pre-antibiotic era surgery. The patients were strangers, their faces etched with suffering, their eyes pleading. He could smell the carbolic acid, feel the cold steel of unfamiliar instruments in his hand. The most disturbing part was waking up. One morning, after a particularly intense dream where he'd spent hours meticulously suturing a deep laceration on a young woman's arm, he woke to find faint, reddish indentations on his own fingertips, exactly where the pressure of a suture needle would have been. Another time, after dreaming of restraining a delirious man suffering from high fever, he found a faint, fading bruise on his forearm, as if he'd been gripped tightly. He tried switching to bottled water he'd brought, but his supplies were dwindling. The spring water was so convenient, so pure. And despite the unsettling dreams, he was, undeniably, sleeping more deeply than he had in years. He told himself it was stress, his subconscious replaying medical anxieties in this evocative setting. But a cold knot of fear was tightening in his gut. These weren't just dreams, they felt like memories, experiences lived. Part 3, Echoes in the Archives. The sanitarium's basement was a labyrinth of damp stone and cobweb-draped shelves. It housed the old archives, stacks of leather-bound ledgers and boxes of patient files, untouched for decades. Driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't explain, Alastair began to explore them, a flickering flashlight his only guide. The air was thick with the smell of decaying paper and something else, a faint, lingering scent of medicinal herbs and old sorrow. He pulled out a ledger dated 1932. The ink was faded, the handwriting spidery. He flipped through the pages, names and ailments blurring before his eyes. Then, a name caught his attention, Eliza Mayhew. Admitted, June 7, 1932. Diagnosis, puerperal fever. He remembered her. The young woman from his dream, the one with the lacerated arm he'd sutured, a complication from childbirth, the dream had implied. He scanned the notes. Severe hemorrhaging, septicemia, patient expired June 14, 1932. A photograph was clipped to the page, a faded, solemn face, undeniably the woman from his dream. His blood ran cold. He frantically searched for other names, other faces he recognized from the dream ward. Thomas Ashton, lung congestion, persistent cough, the man he'd auscultated, whose chest had rattled with fluid. Sarah Blackwood, melancholia, refusal to eat, the frail woman he tried to coax into taking broth. They were all there, their stories briefly, tragically chronicled in these forgotten files. Patients from the 1930s, people he could never have known, whose illnesses and treatments he was experiencing firsthand in his sleep, night after night. The spring water. It had to be the water. Mrs. Gable had said it was special. He hadn't realized how special. It wasn't just healing his insomnia, it was connecting him, somehow, to the sanitarium's past, to the spirits or memories of those who had suffered and been treated here. Part 4, The Weight of Shared Suffering. Alastair stopped drinking the water. He drove miles to the nearest town for bottled supplies, his old insomnia returning with a vengeance, accompanied now by a gnawing dread of what sleep might bring if he succumbed. But the sanitarium itself seemed to hold the memories. Even without the water, faint dream echoes persisted, and the waking marks, though less frequent, still sometimes appeared. He felt trapped, a conduit for forgotten suffering. He spent his days immersed in the archives, no longer just a caretaker but an archaeologist of sorrow. He learned the names, the faces, the all too brief stories of Marble Creek's former patients. He saw the limitations of medicine in that era, the desperate measures, the frequent futility. He felt their pain, their fear, their faint, flickering hopes. The dreams, when they broke through his exhausted resistance, were less about him performing procedures and more about him being with them, offering a silent, anachronistic comfort. He'd sit by their bedsides, listen to their delirious ramblings, hold their hands. One night, he dreamt of a young boy, Daniel, listed in the archives as suffering from consumption. In the dream, Daniel was terrified of the dark, of being alone. Alastair found himself humming a lullaby his own mother used to sing, a tune from a different century. The boy in the dream seemed to calm, his breathing easing. Alastair woke with tears on his cheeks, the phantom sensation of a small, cold hand clutching his. On his bedside table, a small, smooth gray stone, like one from Marble Creek's bed, rested where nothing had been before. The lines between past and present, dream and reality, his own identity and those of the long-dead patients, were becoming dangerously blurred. He was Dr. Alastair Finch, insomniac physician from the 21st century. But he was also, in some inexplicable way, a part of Marble Creek's 1930s ward, a witness, a participant, a sharer of their final moments. Part 5, The Spring's Eternal Memory. His initial 3-month tenure stretched into 6. Mrs. Gable would visit occasionally, bringing supplies, always remarking on how much better Alastair looked, how rested. She never asked about his work beyond the basic caretaking. He never told her about the dreams, the archives, the water. How could he? He started drinking from the spring again, in small, deliberate amounts. The deep sleep returned, and with it, the vivid immersion in the past. But it was different now. The fear had largely subsided, replaced by a profound, sorrowful empathy. He no longer woke with the marks of procedures, but sometimes with the faint scent of carbolic acid on his hands, or the echo of a name whispered in his ear. He was no longer just an observer, he was a custodian of their stories, their unremembered pains. The water wasn't just a conduit, it was the sanitarium's memory, its very essence, and it had chosen him. He began leaving small tokens in the rooms he knew certain patients had occupied, a wildflower for Eliza Mayhew, a polished stone for young Daniel. He found an old, empty journal in the archives and began to write, not as Alastair Finch, but as an unnamed physician of Marble Creek, detailing the cases, the small victories, the many losses, giving voice to those who had none left. His handwriting, he noticed with a detached sort of curiosity, was subtly changing, taking on the spidery elegance of the entries from the 1930s. When Mrs. Gable next came, she found Alastair sitting on the porch, staring out at the whispering trees, a look of serene, almost beatific calm on his face. He seemed older, his eyes holding a depth of experience that belied his years. "You've decided to stay on a while longer, Doctor?" she asked gently. Alistair smiled, a slow, quiet smile. "I believe so, Mrs. Gable. There's still much work to be done here. The waters, they have a way of holding on to things. And someone needs to listen." He no longer fought the dreams. He welcomed them. He was part of Marble Creek now, woven into its fabric, its history. The healing spring hadn't just cured his insomnia, it had given him a purpose, a word of silent, waiting souls, and a place where the past was never truly past, just waiting to be remembered, one dream, one drink of water, at a time. The Last Census. Part 1, The White Silence of Anacosky. The aging snowmobile coughed, sputtered, and died, surrendering to the relentless Finnish winter. Elias Virtanen, a civil servant trainee barely out of university, swore under his breath, the sound swallowed by the oppressive, snow-laden silence of Anacosky. He was miles from the nearest passable road, sent on a fool's errand to complete a population census in this half-forgotten smudge of a village clinging to the edge of the Arctic Circle. Communication with Anacosky had been sporadic for years, the last proper census a decade overdue. Now, with a blizzard howling in, he was stranded. Anacosky was less a village and more a scattering of dark, hunched houses almost buried in snowdrifts, smoke curling thinly from a few chimneys like distress signals. The few villagers Elias encountered were unsettling. Weather-beaten faces, eyes that held a strange, watchful stillness, and a dialect so thick and archaic it was almost a different language. They answered his official questions with evasive monosyllables, their gaze often drifting towards the impenetrable forest that pressed in on all sides. Old Kaisa, a woman whose face was a roadmap of harsh winters, reluctantly offered him shelter in her cramped, smoky cottage. When he explained his purpose, showing her the official census forms, her eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Census," she rasped, her voice like stones grinding together. "Another one comes. Always, they come." She paused, then added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "The last one, he came for the census. He stayed." She made a small, almost warding gesture towards the forest. Elias tried to dismiss it as rural superstition, the ramblings of an isolated old woman. His job was to collect data, facts and figures, not local folklore. Yet, a seed of unease had been planted in the frozen soil of his pragmatic mind. Part 2, Echoes on Official Paper. The next morning, the blizzard had eased, leaving Anacosky entombed in a pristine, silent white. Armed with his list of addresses, many of which seemed to correspond to homes that were clearly derelict, swallowed by snow and time, Elias began his grim task. The first few occupied houses yielded the same frustratingly vague responses. They'd confirmed their names, reluctantly, but questions about family, occupation, even the number of residents, were met with shrugs, mumbled deflections, or a pointed stare towards the ever-present forest. It was at the third occupied dwelling, a small, leaning cabin belonging to a taciturn woodcutter named Pekka, that the real strangeness began. Pekka, after much coaxing, finally produced a completed census form. Not one of Elias's, but an older, slightly yellowed version, yet undeniably official. Elias frowned. Perhaps the last census taker had left spares. He took the form. The handwriting was neat, precise. He scanned the details, Pekka Leitinen, born 1968, occupation logger, then his eyes snagged on the enumerator section at the bottom. The name written there, in clear block capitals, was Elias Virtanen. His own name. He stared, his heart lurching. This was impossible. A coincidence? A common name? But the birth date listed beneath the enumerator's name, it was his birth date. He felt a wave of dizziness. Pekka just watched him, his face impassive. "Form is filled," he grunted. "Good." Shaken, Elias moved on. At the next house, a similar scenario. An old woman, Marta, handed him another pre-filled form. Again, his name as the enumerator, his birth date. But this form contained more. Under a section titled, Anticipated Life Events, Enumerator Only, for statistical projection, there was an entry, Minor Vehicular Accident, Helsinki, March 2024. No serious injuries. Elias's blood ran cold. He had been in a minor fender bender in Helsinki the previous March. A detail no one here could possibly know. He looked at Marta, his voice trembling. Where did you get this? She just smiled, a slow, knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. The forms are always provided. Part 3, The Future Foretold, the Past Unchanged. Each occupied house he visited from then on presented him with a similar, pre-filled census form. And each form, under his own name as enumerator, contained increasingly personal, chillingly accurate details from his life, his mother's maiden name, his university thesis topic, even a private nickname only his childhood best friend used. The Anticipated Life Events section became a source of mounting dread. One form, from a silent, watchful man named Yanni, listed, promotion to senior archivist, National Records Office, June 2027. A career path he'd idly considered, but never voiced to anyone. Another, from a family with too many children who all stared with the same unervingly pale eyes, predicted, marriage to Anna Ristolainen, August 2029. 2 children, Leo, Sophia. Anna Ristolainen was a girl he'd dated briefly, years ago. The thought of marrying her, having children with her, was a phantom future he'd never contemplated. The accuracy was terrifying. It wasn't just guesswork, it was his life, laid out on official government paper, years in advance. He tried to reason it away. Was this some elaborate prank? A sophisticated psychological experiment? But the isolation, the archaic nature of the village. The genuine fear in old Kaisa's voice when she spoke of the census taker who stayed, it all pointed to something far more ancient and inexplicable. He found himself drawn to the derelict houses on his list, pushing through snowdrifts to peer into their collapsing interiors. In one, half buried under a fallen roof beam, he found a tattered, moldy census form. The enumerator's name was different, Michael Hoppala. But the details beneath it, the predicted life events, were eerily specific to a life lived and ended. He later found a weathered wooden cross in the tiny, overgrown village graveyard with the same name and dates that corresponded roughly to the predicted lifespan on the form. Michael Hoppala, the census taker who stayed. Part 4, The Final Form. Elias was no longer just a civil servant, he was a man confronting his own pre-written destiny in the most bizarre and terrifying way. The remaining villagers offered him their completed forms with a strange mixture of pity and resignation. He stopped asking where they got them. He knew, somehow, that the forms simply appeared. Manifested by whatever ancient intelligence governed Äänekoski and its grim census. He had only one address left on his list, a small, isolated cabin even further towards the forest, marked as belonging to an Niemi. He trudged through the deepening snow, a sense of fatalistic dread his only companion. The cabin was dark, seemingly abandoned. He pushed open the creaking door. Inside, it was freezing, dust lying thick on a single table and chair. And on the table, lay a census form. His census form. The one meant for Niemi. But this form was different. It wasn't filled out by Niemi. It was filled out for Elias Virtanen. His name was in the main section, not as enumerator, but as resident. Under current occupation, it read, Village Enumerator, Äänekoski. Under duration of stay, it stated, indefinite. And the anticipated life events section contained only one, final entry, completion of the Äänekoski census. Integration into the community. The forest will provide. Elias sank into the dusty chair, the form trembling in his hands. He understood now. The census wasn't about counting the living, it was about recruiting the next caretaker of their secrets, the next link in an unending chain. The villagers weren't evasive out of hostility, but because they knew the pattern. They were witnesses to a recurring rite. Nimi likely never existed, or was perhaps the placeholder for the next unfortunate soul drawn into Anakoski's web. Part 5, The Unseen Enumerator. The blizzard returned with a vengeance that night, trapping Elias completely. He huddled in the freezing cabin, the final census form his only companion. He didn't try to burn it. He knew it wouldn't work. The forms were part of Anakoski, as immutable as the ancient forest and the endless winter. Days turned into weeks. His meager supplies ran out. The villagers, silent and watchful, began leaving small offerings of food, dried fish, hard bread, at his cabin door. They never spoke, just left the provisions and retreated. He was being cared for, assimilated. One morning, he woke to find a new stack of blank census forms on the table, pristine and official. Beside them lay a sharpened pencil. He looked at his own hands. They seemed older, rougher, like the hands of the villagers. He felt a strange calm, a resignation that was almost peaceful. The future, so terrifyingly laid out for him, was now simply the present. He picked up a form. He knew, without knowing how, the names of the households that would require one. He knew the details he needed to record, the subtle cadence of their evasions, the direction of their gaze towards the forest. He was no longer Elias Virtanen, trainee civil servant from Helsinki. He was the enumerator of Anakoski. He never tried to leave. The forest, vast and silent, seemed to hold him in its embrace. The villagers accepted him as one of their own, another fixture in their timeless landscape. And every few years, when the outside world remembered Anakoski and sent a new, unsuspecting soul to complete the census, Elias would be there. Ready with a pre-filled form, a chillingly accurate prophecy of a life about to be irrevocably changed. He was the one who had come for the census, and stayed. The last census was never truly the last, it was merely the beginning of the next. Refrigerator number 7. Part 1, The Cold Watch. The hum was the first thing Markchan registered, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor and up his legs. It was the sound of cryogenic preservation, the ceaseless labor of machines battling entropy in the subterranean vaults of hear.Slip North, a state-of-the-art, or so they claimed, facility nestled discreetly beneath the Canadian Shield. Mark, a biomedical technician with a knack for troubleshooting aging equipment, was on a temporary contract, filling in for the regular night shift supervisor who'd abruptly taken extended leave. His domain was a sterile, echoing labyrinth of corridors lined with gleaming stainless steel cryopreservation units, each one a silent, frozen testament to humanity's desperate gamble against mortality. Each unit, or refrigerator, as the staff colloquially called them, held a client, suspended in liquid nitrogen, awaiting a future that might never come. Mark's job was to monitor the vitals, the internal temperatures, the nitrogen levels, the faint, algorithmically maintained biosignatures that proved the clients were, in theory, still viable. It was a lonely, unsettling vigil, surrounded by the sleeping dead. Most nights were a monotonous cycle of system checks and data logging. But refrigerator number 7, in Bay C, was becoming a problem. It was an older model, a hulking beast of brushed steel that had always been a little temperamental. Lately, its quirks had escalated. Mark had noticed anomalous temperature spikes, brief and quickly self-correcting, but outside normal parameters. And sometimes, very late at night, when the facility was at its quietest, he thought he heard sounds emanating from it, not the usual mechanical groans, but something softer, more organic. A faint, rhythmic scraping, almost like movement. Part 2, Glitches in the Cryostream. Mark meticulously documented number 7's anomalies. The temperature fluctuations were logged, the strange sounds noted with a question mark. He ran diagnostics, the unit always passed, its internal sensors reporting optimal conditions moments after each glitch. His supervisor, a remote, disembodied voice named Dr. Albright who only communicated via secure comms, was dismissive. Unit 7 has always been sensitive, Chen. Monitor, but don't overreact. These older systems have ghosts in the machine. The ghosts became more insistent. The security camera feed for Bay C, which included a direct view of number 7, started exhibiting bizarre interference whenever the temperature spikes occurred. The image would flicker, pixelate, or briefly show ghostly, indistinct silhouettes superimposed over the cryo unit, too fleeting and distorted to identify, but vaguely humanoid. Mark replayed the corrupted footage endlessly, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. One night, during a particularly pronounced temperature spike from number 7, the primary biometric monitor for its occupant, a client designation, C007, anonymized, suddenly flared to life. For a few frantic seconds, it displayed erratic but definite cardiac rhythms and faint neural activity, patterns that shouldn't have been possible from a body frozen at -196 degrees Celsius. Then, just as quickly, the readings flatlined back to the standard near-zero stasis. Mark stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This wasn't a mechanical ghost. This was impossible. He saved the data burst, his hand shaking as he initiated another deep diagnostic on refrigerator number 7. Again, all systems green. Part 3, the erased log. Driven by a growing dread, Mark decided to delve into the facility's older, archived shift logs. Most were digitized, but the records for the older units, like number 7, were rumored to still exist on outdated hard drives in a dusty sub-basement storage room. Dr. Albright had warned him against unnecessary exploration of deprecated systems, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that number 7's current issues weren't new. After hours of navigating archaic file systems, he found it, a corrupted log file specifically for Bay C, dating back nearly 30 years. Much of it was unreadable, a jumble of garbled code. But one section, laboriously recovered using data retrieval software, was partially intact. It was a shift report, handwritten notes scanned and poorly digitized. The entry, dated November 14, 1993, described almost identical malfunctions with refrigerator number 7, unexplained temperature spikes, anomalous sounds, scraping, movement detected from within unit, and interference with monitoring equipment. Then, a sentence made Mark's blood run cold. It was scrawled, "Urgent, Night Tech M. Chen reports visual confirmation of internal movement in C007 during unscheduled thaw event. Recommending immediate full system purge and client reevaluation. Security override initiated by Albright. M. Chen. His initial. His surname. 30 years ago." He stared at the screen, disbelief warring with a sickening sense of predestination. This couldn't be him. He was only 35 now, he would have been a child in 1993. A different M. Chen. A bizarre coincidence. But the description of the events, the mention of an unscheduled thaw event and an override by Albright, presumably a younger version of his current, faceless supervisor, it was all too specific, too eerily resonant with what he was experiencing now. Part 4, the recurring nightmare. The discovery of the old log entry shattered Mark's remaining composure. He felt caught in a loop, a recurring nightmare played out decades apart. Was he predisposed to this facility, to this specific, malfunctioning cryo unit? Was his temporary contract some carefully orchestrated replay? He confronted Dr. Albright over the secure comms, his voice trembling with barely suppressed panic, demanding an explanation for the old log, for the mention of his name. Albright's response was chillingly calm, almost bored. "Log integrity from that era is unreliable, Chen. Data corruption is common. Focus on your current duties. Unit 7 requires stabilization, not historical speculation." But Mark couldn't let it go. The sounds from number 7 grew more distinct, the scraping more insistent. The ghostly silhouettes on the camera feed became slightly more defined, hinting at a struggle, a desperate attempt to, what? Escape? Awaken? He started having vivid nightmares of being trapped in the freezing darkness of a cryo unit, his limbs heavy, his breath frosting, a silent scream trapped in his frozen throat. He found another fragment in the corrupted 1993 log. A follow-up entry, barely legible, Albright denies M. Chen's report. States tech suffering from stress-induced paranoia. C007 restabilized. M. Chen placed on indefinite medical leave. File sealed. Indefinite medical leave. Just like his predecessor on this current shift. The pattern was undeniable. He felt a desperate need to know who, or what, was inside refrigerator number 7. Client C007. The records were sealed, heavily encrypted, even beyond his access level. But the unit itself had a small, tarnished brass plaque, almost hidden beneath a layer of frost. He carefully scraped it clear. 2 words were engraved, Markochenko. A Slavic name. Similar to his own. A distant relative, perhaps, from a forgotten branch of his family. The coincidence was too great, too specific. Was this some ancestral curse, playing out in the frozen depths of Cryosleep North? Part 5, The Unthawing Truth. The final night of Mark's contract arrived, or what he assumed would be his final night. Refrigerator number 7 was more active than ever. The temperature inside was spiking wildly, alarms blaring silently on his monitors, overridden by some higher command he couldn't trace. The scraping from within was frantic, accompanied now by muffled, percussive thuds. The camera feed for Bay C was almost entirely obscured by violent static, but through it, Mark could see the heavy door of number 7 bulging slightly, frost cracking around its seals. Then, his secure calm crackled. Dr. Albright's voice, devoid of its usual calm, sharp with urgency. Chen. Unit 7 is undergoing a critical, uncontrolled thaw. We're reading, full biological resurgence. Security protocols are failing. You need to initiate emergency cryopurge protocol Omega 7, manual override. Now. Protocol Omega 7. Mark knew what that meant. A catastrophic, rapid refreeze, designed to halt any unscheduled reanimation, but with extreme risk to the client's neural integrity. Essentially, it would destroy whatever was waking up inside. He raced to Bay C. The air around number 7 was frigid, yet the unit itself radiated a strange, internal heat. The thudding from within was louder, more desperate. Through a small, ice-rimmed viewport he'd never noticed before, he saw it, a hand, pale and gaunt, pressing against the reinforced glass from the inside, fingers splayed. He reached for the manual override panel. His hand hovered over the red Omega 7 button. 30 years ago, another M. Chen had reported internal movement, had tried to warn them. Had that Chen been him, in some earlier iteration of this nightmare? Was Markochenko his doppelganger, his ancestor, his future self trapped in a temporal loop within the cryogenic hell? The thudding stopped. A voice, hoarse and weak, crackled from number 7's external speaker, a system only activated during controlled thaws. Let me out. Elias, no. Mark, they know, it's happening again. It wasn't his name, not quite. But close enough. And the voice, it sounded horrifyingly familiar, like his own, but aged, broken. Mark stumbled back, his mind reeling. He didn't press the button. He couldn't. Instead, he hit the master alarm for the facility, a wailing siren that echoed through the empty vaults. He fled, leaving refrigerator number 7 and its reawakening occupant to whatever fate awaited them. He never knew what happened after he triggered the alarm. His contract was terminated immediately, a substantial severance package deposited into his account with a legally binding non-disclosure agreement. He never heard from Cryosleep North or Dr. Albright again. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, Mark Chen still hears a faint, rhythmic scraping sound, and the hum of refrigeration units. And he wonders about Markochenko, and the M. Chen from 30 years ago, and whether the cycle will ever truly be broken, or if, somewhere in the frozen heart of Canada, refrigerator number 7 is still waiting, patiently, for its next namesake technician to arrive and witness its impossible, recurring resurrection. The apartment on 3rd. Part 1, Concrete Solitude. The silence of the Berlin Plattenbau was a balm to Lena's ears, thick and still after the clamor of her recent past. The city's pulse thrummed distantly, a muffled heartbeat beneath the concrete, but here, on the third floor of this anonymous 1970s panel house, it felt like a different world. She'd fled Paris, her marriage dissolving into bitter recriminations, seeking not just a new city, but a new self. This apartment, with its stark lines and unadorned surfaces, was meant to be a clean slate, a blank canvas for a life rebuilt. It was quintessential Plattenbau. Prefabricated concrete panels, efficient, functional, and utterly devoid of soul. The floors were linoleum, the walls painted a uniform, institutional off-white. Yet, to Lena, it offered the promise of anonymity, a space where she could disappear and heal. Her few boxes of belongings seemed swallowed by the large, empty rooms. She set about unpacking, arranging her small collection of books, setting up her old record player. The apartment felt vast, almost echoing with its own emptiness. She hoped to fill it, eventually, with a new purpose. She spent the first few days in a daze of cleaning and organizing. The apartment had been empty for a while, a fine layer of dust clinging to everything. Lena, meticulous by nature, cleaned thoroughly, scrubbing the kitchen tiles until they gleamed, wiping down every surface in the living room until it felt pristine. She even polished the small, built-in shelves in the hallway, running her fingers over the smooth, cool laminate. Exhausted but satisfied, she fell into bed each night, the silence of the concrete shell wrapping around her like a shroud. Part 2, The Impossible Percussion. The first anomaly was so subtle, she dismissed it as a trick of the old building, or her own overactive imagination. A faint, rhythmic tapping, seeming to come from the wall behind her bed. She assumed it was a neighbor, perhaps hammering a picture. But the wall in question was the exterior load-bearing wall, a solid slab of concrete separating her from the outside world. There was no one behind it. The tapping became more distinct over the next few nights, a slow, deliberate cadence, sometimes accompanied by a muffled thud. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and unhurried, moving across a floor that simply wasn't there. She'd press her ear to the cold concrete, hearing nothing but the low thrum of her own blood. Yet, when she pulled away, the impossible sounds would resume, a phantom percussion in the heart of the wall. Then, the appliances started acting up. Her kettle, cold and unplugged, would sometimes emit a soft click, as if switched on. Her old radio, sitting silently on the kitchen counter, would suddenly crackle to life with static for a few moments, then die. Her television, switched off at the mains, would occasionally show a brief, ghostly flicker on its screen. Minor glitches, easily attributable to old wiring, faulty plugs, the stress she was under. But the dust was harder to explain. Each morning, after a thorough cleaning the day before, she'd find a fine, almost imperceptible layer of dust accumulated on the kitchen counter, or across the living room floor, specifically in areas she'd just polished. It was as if a silent, invisible presence was constantly moving through her meticulously cleaned space, shedding microscopic particles in its wake. The apartment, she began to realize, wasn't as empty as it seemed. And the walls, she feared, were not as solid as they looked. Part 3, The Echo of a Face. The impossible sounds escalated. The rhythmic thumping behind the exterior wall gained a certain intention. Sometimes, when Lena made a noise, dropping a book, scraping a chair, a faint, almost immediate thump would echo back from the wall, a silent, unnerving response. The footsteps were clearer now, a distinct shuffle, a slow, deliberate pacing. The appliance glitches became more frequent, more specific. The kettle would actually hum for a second, the TV screen would show a flicker of static, not just a ghost of a light. It felt like someone else was living a parallel life, just beyond her perception, using her home. One afternoon, while trying to fix a jammed drawer in an old built-in cabinet in the living room, her fingers brushed against something hidden in the deep recess. A small, unlabeled VHS tape. It felt heavy, brittle with age. She had an old VCR in one of her boxes, a relic she'd kept for sentimental reasons. She hooked it up, her hands trembling with a premonition. The screen flickered, then resolved into a grainy, faded image of her own apartment. The same linoleum, the same ugly kitchen tiles, the same view from the window of the identical Plattenbau across the way. The date stamp in the corner read, 1987. And then she saw her. A woman, moving through the apartment. She was wearing a faded house dress, humming softly as she tidied the kitchen, then moved to the living room, settling into an armchair. The woman was ordinary, unremarkable in every way, except for one chilling detail: she looked remarkably, uncannily, like Lena. Her face, her hair, her build, a ghost of a reflection of Lena herself, separated by decades. Lena watched, mesmerized and horrified. The woman on the tape was cleaning, humming to herself. Then, she walked to the exact spot where Lena now stood, and began to polish the built-in shelves. And as she watched, Lena felt the same faint, inexplicable film of dust settling on her fingers, exactly where she had noticed it earlier that day. The dust. The cleaning. The sounds. It wasn't a glitch. It was a life, playing out again, for her. Part 4, The Unseen Life, Observed. Lena became obsessed with the videotape. She watched it endlessly, replaying moments, freezing frames, her sanity fraying with each viewing. The woman on the tape, her doppelganger, became her constant companion. She noticed the timings: the woman on the tape would pace in the living room, and a few minutes later, the faint, rhythmic thumping would begin behind Lena's external wall. The woman on the tape would switch on a lamp, and Lena's living room lamp, unplugged, would briefly flicker. The horror wasn't just that the woman looked like her, or that she was experiencing impossible echoes of her life. It was the dawning realization that the events on the tape were the noise behind the panel. This woman's routine, her very existence within these concrete walls decades ago, was somehow bleeding into Lena's present, a persistent, physical echo. The dust wasn't just randomly appearing, it was the microscopic debris of a life being lived, relived, in her very space. She began to understand the full terror of it. The apartment wasn't just haunted, it was a recording device, or perhaps a temporal echo chamber. The Plattenbau, built for repetition and uniformity, had somehow trapped a past life, forcing it to play out again and again. And Lena, by moving in, by existing in the same space, was not just an observer, but perhaps a participant, or even a replacement. Her own life began to merge with the tape. She found herself subconsciously adopting the postures of the woman on the screen, the way she held her teacup, the way she gazed out the window. She started talking to the wall, to the presence. Why are you here? What happened? The answers were always the same: a faint thump, a cold draft, the persistent presence of invisible dust. Part 5, The Panel's Embrace. Lena stopped trying to fight it. She knew what was happening now. The apartment on 3rd, her promised clean slate, was an inescapable loop. The woman on the tape was not a random doppelganger, she was a predecessor, or perhaps a predestined echo. The noise behind the panel wasn't just a phenomenon, it was the apartment's continuous breathing, its heartbeat, composed of the lives it had absorbed. One night, watching the tape, the woman on the screen walked into the kitchen, turned on the kettle, then leaned against the counter, humming. Simultaneously, in Lena's present kitchen, the unplugged kettle clicked on, a faint hum rising from its cold coil, and Lena felt an inexplicable urge to hum the same tune. She did. The air shimmered. She knew she had to leave. She started packing, frantic and desperate. But as she folded a shirt, a faint, rhythmic tapping began behind the external wall. She paused, the tapping growing insistent, faster. It was the rhythm of a heart, desperate and afraid. She looked at the tape. The woman was standing by the window, staring out, her face a mask of fear. Lena found herself walking to the window, mimicking the woman on the tape. She pressed her hand to the cold glass. The wall behind her pulsed with an invisible energy. The air was thick with the dust of ages, not just a thin film, but a heavier presence that felt like static electricity. She saw her reflection in the glass, and for a terrifying second, it was not her own face looking back, but the grainy, distant visage of the woman from the tape. Eyes wide with a familiar terror. She never left the apartment. Her last memory was watching the tape run out, the screen dissolving into static. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the woman on the tape had eventually vanished, absorbed by the apartment's relentless cycle. Now, it was her turn. Days, weeks passed. Lena, or what remained of her, moved through the apartment, performing her daily routines. The kettle clicked on, the radio hummed with static, the television flickered. The dust accumulated in precise patterns on the linoleum. And sometimes, in the dead of night, a faint, rhythmic tapping could be heard from behind the exterior load-bearing wall, a soft but insistent thud, a constant reminder of the life lived, the life being lived, and the new noise for whoever might, one day, move into the apartment on 3rd. The concrete panels of the Plattenbau held their secrets well, and they rarely gave them back. Dome Farm. Part 1, The Oasis of Glass and Steel. The sun beat down on the ochre desolation of the Australian outback with relentless ferocity. Dr. Eris Thorne, a botanical engineer with a penchant for challenging assignments, shielded his eyes, the heat shimmering off the endless expanse of red dirt. Then he saw it, a mirage made real, a colossal geodesic dome, single array of glass and steel rising from the wasteland like a fallen alien mothership. This was Ednea, or as the locals wryly called it, Dome Farm, an ambitious, now abandoned, agro-industrial biodome project from the late 90s. Eris had been contracted by a shadowy consortium that had recently acquired the site. His task, a thorough inspection of the internal climate control systems, the hydroponics, and the dormant botanical specimens, to assess viability for potential reactivation. The project had been mothballed over a decade ago due to insurmountable operational costs, or so the official story went. The airlock hissed, and Eris stepped inside. The contrast was immediate and shocking. The brutal desert heat gave way to a humid, balmy warmth. Lush, verdant foliage pressed in on all sides, a riot of green against the curved glass panels. Towering ferns, exotic fruit trees, and strange, unidentifiable vines created a dense, artificial jungle. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, blossoms, and something else, a faint, cloyingly sweet, almost musky aroma. The climate control, despite years of neglect, was still functioning, maintaining a perfect, Edenic environment. Too perfect, perhaps. He set up a temporary base in the old control room, a dusty hub of outdated computer consoles and flickering monitors. The silence, after the hum of his Jeep, was profound, broken only by the drip of condensation and the rustle of unseen things in the dense undergrowth. The dome felt alive, breathing, a self-contained world oblivious to the harsh desert outside. Part 2, The Unnatural Growth. Eris began his survey, navigating the overgrown pathways, checking sensors, and taking samples. The plants were thriving, astonishingly so. Growth rates seemed unnaturally accelerated. Seedlings he identified from old botanical manifests as being only a few years old were already mature, fruit-bearing specimens. But it wasn't just the speed, it was the shapes. Vines coiled in tight, muscular spirals that resembled flexed limbs. The broad leaves of certain tropical plants seemed to unfurl like splayed hands, their veins prominent like sinews. The bark of some trees was gnarled and contorted, forming patterns that, if he squinted, looked unsettlingly like human torsos or elongated faces caught in silent screams. He saw a cluster of oversized gourds that, in the dim, filtered light, bore a disturbing resemblance to pale, featureless human heads. He dismissed it as pareidolia, his mind playing tricks in the strange, isolated environment. Yet, the feeling persisted. The flora of Ednea wasn't just growing, it was mimicking. Evolving in unsettling, almost anthropomorphic ways. The sweet, musky scent, he realized, was strongest around these strangely formed plants. At night, the dome transformed. The sophisticated lighting system, still on its automated cycle, cast long, dancing shadows. Motion sensors he'd activated around the perimeter of the central hydroponics bay would occasionally trigger, showing brief, inexplicable spikes of activity on his monitors. He'd investigate, armed with a powerful flashlight, only to find the dense foliage undisturbed, the air still and heavy. But the feeling of being watched, of unseen movement just beyond the periphery of his vision, was constant. Part 3, The Ghost in the Logbook. In the control room, amidst stacks of faded technical manuals, Eris found an old, handwritten duty log. Its cover was stained, its pages brittle. The official records he'd been given stated that Idnia had been fully automated for remote monitoring in its final years, with no permanent staff on site for at least a decade. Yet, this logbook contained entries, scrawled and increasingly erratic, dating up to only 5 years ago. The entries were peculiar. They weren't the terse, technical notes he expected. They were written in the first person, deeply personal, almost like a diary. The author, unnamed, described the dome's routines, the behavior of the plants, and a growing sense of unease, then fascination. Day 73. The new hybrid orchids are expressive. They turn towards me when I enter Bay Gamma. Almost like they're listening. Day 156. Woke to find the Venus flytraps had arranged themselves in a circle around my bunk. Their traps were open, as if in greeting. Or hunger. Day 210. The air is thicker today. Sweeter. The plants are whispering. I think I understand what they want. The handwriting deteriorated as the entries progressed, becoming a desperate scrawl. The final entry, dated roughly 5 years prior, was almost illegible. They bloom for me. I feed them. We are one now. The dome is complete. No need for sun. We make our own light. Our own fruit. After that, blank pages. Eris felt a chill crawl up his spine despite the dome's warmth. Who was this person? Why were they here, unrecorded, undocumented? And what did they mean, we are one now? He cross-referenced the dates with the official access logs he had. No authorized personnel had entered Idnia during that period. The logbook was a ghost story, written by a phantom. Part 4, The Bloom of Recognition. The discovery of the logbook cast a sinister pall over Eris's investigation. The strangely shaped plants now seemed less like natural curiosities and more like deliberate, sentient creations. He began to notice more details, the way certain flowers, with their fleshy petals and deep crimson throats, seemed to mimic open mouths. The subtle, almost imperceptible pulse he could sometimes feel through the damp soil, like a vast, slow heartbeat beneath his feet. The motion sensors at night became more active, the fleeting shapes captured on the grainy security footage less like animals and more upright, moving with a strange, gliding gait through the densest parts of the artificial jungle. Eris started barricading the control room door at night, the silence of the dome now filled with imagined rustlings and the heavy, sweet scent that seemed to seep through the very walls. He took a closer look at a particularly large, strangely bulbous plant near the central irrigation unit. Its surface was smooth, pale, and eerily skin-like. As he examined it, he noticed a faint discoloration, a pattern beneath the surface. He carefully scraped away a small section of the outer layer with his multi-tool. Underneath, embedded within the plant's flesh, was a small, metallic object. A button. A tarnished, brass button, identical to those on the standard issue Idnia work coveralls he'd seen hanging in a forgotten locker. He stumbled back, a gasp caught in his throat. He looked around at the grotesque, anthropomorphic flora with new, horrified eyes. The fruit mentioned in the logbook. The whispering plants. The figures on the security feed. They weren't just plants. They were something else. Something that had once been human. He remembered the logbook author's final, chilling words, "We are one now." The dome hadn't just sustained life, it had consumed it, transformed it, incorporated it into its own bizarre, verdant ecosystem. The perfect climate, the accelerated growth, it was all geared towards this grotesque metamorphosis. Part 5, The Unwilling Gardener. Eris knew he had to get out. He packed his essential equipment, his hands shaking, his mind reeling from the implications. The consortium that hired him, what did they really know about Idnia? Were they hoping to reactivate this botanical charnel house? As he prepared to leave the control room, he saw it. A new sprout, pushing its way up through a crack in the concrete floor, right beside his temporary bunk. It was pale, fleshy, and already beginning to unfurl leaves that looked disturbingly like small, grasping fingers. The sweet, musky scent was overpowering. He fled. He didn't wait for the airlock to cycle fully, overriding the safety protocols, desperate to escape the humid, living tomb. He threw his gear into the jeep and sped away, not looking back at the silent, gleaming dome shimmering in the desert heat. He filed his report, heavily edited, focusing only on the technical malfunctions of the climate systems, omitting any mention of the logbook, the anthropomorphic plants, the embedded button. He knew no one would believe him. He resigned from the consortium immediately, citing irreconcilable site conditions. But Idnia stayed with him. He dreamed of the lush, suffocating greenery, the whispering leaves, the pale, skin-like fruit. He'd wake up smelling that cloyingly sweet, musky aroma, convinced it was clinging to his clothes, his skin. Years later, working on a different continent, he received an anonymous data packet. It contained a single, recent satellite image of the Australian desert. Idnia was still there. But it was different. The dome itself seemed larger, its glass panels bulging outwards in places, as if under immense internal pressure. And around its perimeter, where there had once been only barren red dirt, a faint, unmistakable ring of green was beginning to spread outwards, a slow, patient encroachment into the desert. Eris knew. The process hadn't stopped. The dome farm was still growing, still evolving, still hungry. And somewhere, deep inside its verdant, living heart, the author of the logbook, and perhaps others, were still tending their grotesque garden, forever part of the bloom, their human features subtly reflected in the ever-stranger shapes of the plants. The Church on the Lake. Part 1, The Receding Veil. The summer drought had been relentless across Sweden, a creeping, thirsty beast that had shrunk rivers and exposed forgotten shorelines. For Dr. Anders Lundquist, an archaeologist specializing in endangered monuments, it was a mixed blessing. The receding waters of Lake Storstjen, a vast, remote body of water in the northern forests, had revealed something extraordinary, the steeple and upper walls of Kirkustjan, the legendary Church on the Lake. Local folklore claimed Kirkustjan had been a vibrant parish church centuries ago. Built on a small island, until a catastrophic flood or perhaps a slow subsidence had claimed it, pulling it beneath the waters. It had become a myth, a whisper among fishermen who occasionally snagged their nets on unseen underwater structures. Now, thanks to the drought, it was emerging, a skeletal stone finger pointing accusingly at the sky from the lake's shrunken heart. Anders, a man driven by a quiet passion for the past and a melancholic awareness of its fragility, set up a makeshift camp on the newly exposed mudflats. The church was a haunting sight, its weathered gray stone streaked with algae, its empty windows like hollow eye sockets. The main structure was still half submerged, but enough was visible to suggest its former, humble grandeur. He spent his days meticulously photographing, sketching, and taking measurements, racing against the eventual return of the waters. The silence was profound, broken only by the lapping of the diminished lake against the mud and the mournful cry of distant loons. Part 2, The Impossible Descent. The historical blueprints of Kirkustjan, painstakingly sourced from regional archives, showed a simple, single-nave structure with a small sacristy. There was no mention of a crypt or cellar. Yet, as the water level dropped further, revealing more of the church's foundations, Anders made a startling discovery. On the north side, usually deep underwater, a low, arched doorway was exposed, its heavy oak planks swollen and green with algae, but remarkably intact. It wasn't on any of the plans. Curiosity overcoming caution, Anders managed, after considerable effort, to pry the ancient door open. It groaned in protest, releasing a gust of cold, musty air that smelled of damp earth and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or rust. Beyond the doorway, a narrow flight of stone steps spiraled down into blackness. A cellar. Or something more. He returned the next day with powerful lanterns and safety gear. The steps were slick with slime, descending further than he'd anticipated for a simple island church. They opened into a circular, surprisingly dry chamber, its walls lined with empty, arched niches, like a forgotten catacomb. The air here was heavy, still, and the metallic scent was stronger. There were no inscriptions, no artifacts, just the oppressive silence and the weight of centuries. This subterranean room, unrecorded and unexpected, added a new layer of mystery to Kirkus John. He felt a prickle of unease, a sense that this place held secrets it was reluctant to yield. Part 3, Submerged Harmonies. The nights by Lake Storstian became less peaceful. Anders, sleeping fitfully in his tent, began to hear things. At first, he dismissed it as the wind, or the settling of the exposed lakebed. But the sounds grew more distinct, more organized. Faint, ethereal singing, like a distant choir, seemed to drift across the water from the direction of the half-submerged church. It was a wordless, melancholic plainsong, beautiful and deeply unsettling. Then came the bells. Not the loud, joyous peal of a living church, but a muffled, sonorous tolling, as if ringing from a great depth, the sound distorted and warped by the intervening water. It always occurred around what he guessed was midnight, a ghostly summons from the drowned heart of Kirkus John. He'd scramble from his tent, shining his flashlight towards the church, but see nothing but the dark, still water and the silhouette of the stone walls against the moon. The sounds were real, he even tried recording them, but his equipment picked up only the ambient night sounds, the lapping water, the crickets. The singing, the bells, they seemed to exist on a different frequency, audible only to the human ear, or perhaps, only to his. He explored the subterranean chamber again, searching for any clue, any mechanism that could produce such sounds. He found nothing. The niches remained empty, the silence within absolute. Yet, the nightly concerts continued, a spectral liturgy performed for an audience of one. The isolation, the strange discovery, the phantom sounds, it was all beginning to fray his nerves. Part 4, The Returning Tide. One morning, Anders woke to a significant change. Overnight, the water level of Lake Storstian had risen dramatically. A recent heavy rainfall in the distant mountains, the local weather report on his crackling radio informed him. The mudflats around his camp were already shrinking, the lake greedily reclaiming its territory. Kirkus John was noticeably more submerged, the lower windows disappearing once more beneath the waterline. The arched doorway to the subterranean chamber was gone, swallowed by the rising lake. A sense of urgency, tinged with a strange disappointment, spurred him. He had to document what he could before the church vanished completely again. As he approached the familiar north wall, where the hidden door had been, he stopped dead. From beneath the water, where the doorway now lay submerged, a dark, viscous liquid was seeping out, swirling into the clearer lake water like black ink. It carried a strong, cloying smell, a bizarre and sickening combination of stagnant water, mud, and incense. The rich, smoky, resinous aroma of church incense. He stared, horrified. How could incense, a dry, combustible substance, be emanating from a flooded, centuries-old cellar? He cautiously dipped a sample stick into the dark effusion. The liquid was oily, cold, and left a dark stain, the incense smell clinging to it stubbornly. The water around the church was becoming increasingly opaque with this strange, fragrant blackness. The phantom singing that night was louder, more fervent, the submerged bells tolling with a new, almost triumphant resonance. It was as if the rising waters were not drowning the church, but reawakening something within its depths, something that was now bleeding its essence into the lake. Part 5, The Unseen Congregation. The lake continued to rise. Within days, Kirkus John was once again little more than a submerged legend, its steeple barely breaking the surface. But the phenomenon of the black, incense-laden water persisted, a dark stain spreading slowly from the church's location, a fragrant miasma hanging over that part of the lake. Anders packed his camp, his mind a turmoil of scientific rationalism and creeping supernatural dread. His notes were filled with precise measurements and sketches, but also with frantic descriptions of the singing, the bells, the impossible black water. He knew no academic journal would publish this. On his last evening, as dusk settled over the now full lake, he took his small inflatable dinghy out towards where the church lay hidden. The smell of incense was overpowering. The water here was like polished obsidian. He cut the engine, letting the boat drift. The singing began, clearer now than ever, seeming to rise directly from beneath his boat, a full, resonant choir. The bells tolled, their vibrations felt through the hull. And then, he saw it. Or thought he did. Beneath the surface of the black water, faint, pale shapes seemed to be moving, gathering. Indistinct, humanoid forms, flickering in the dim, reflected moonlight, assembling as if for a service in the drowned nave below. He could almost make out rows of them, their heads bowed. Anders didn't wait. He yanked the starter cord, the outboard motor sputtering to life, and fled, the sound of the phantom choir and the tolling bells pursuing him across the dark water. He left Lake Storsjön the next day, his research incomplete, his certainties shattered. He filed a report on the structural details of Kirkustjärn, omitting the more inexplicable elements. But he knew. He knew that the church on the lake was not abandoned. Its congregation was merely unseen, its services held in a sanctuary beyond the reach of drought or flood, its presence announced by the tolling of submerged bells and the strange, holy perfume of its dark, eternal waters. The drought had not uncovered a ruin, it had merely lifted a veil on a timeless, unending ritual. Clock Without Hands. Part 1, The Silent Timekeeper. The scent of old wood, brass polish, and something uniquely dusty and metallic clung to everything in the workshop. Thomas inherited it, along with a mountain of his grandfather's debts, after the old man's quiet passing. Arthur Finch and Son. Horologists, time measured and mended, the faded sign above the small shop front in the sleepy British town of Oakhaven proclaimed. The Son part had never materialized. Thomas's father had fled Oakhaven and its ticking heart years ago. Now it was just Thomas, a young man with nimble fingers, a vague aptitude for mechanics, and a desperate need to make a living. The workshop was a horologist's dream, or perhaps a hoarder's nightmare. Tiny tools lay scattered on scarred workbenches, half-disassembled clock movements gleamed under cobwebs, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the ghosts of a million ticks and tocks. Dominating one wall was the master clock, as grandfather Arthur had called it. It was an enormous, dark oak grandfather clock, its face blank, its hands long gone. Its pendulum hung still, its weights were unslung. It was, to all appearances, inert, a silent monument to time itself. Thomas planned to clear out the unsalvageable, restore the valuable, and perhaps, just perhaps, make a go of the family business. He was good with his hands, patient. Maybe this was his calling. He spent the first few days sorting, cleaning, trying to impose order on his grandfather's charming chaos. He largely ignored the master clock, assuming it was a decorative, non-functional piece, perhaps a project the old man never finished. Then, late one evening, as he was locking up, he heard it. A soft, steady tick-tock. He froze. All the other clocks in the workshop were either disassembled or wound down. He traced the sound. It was coming from the master clock. He pressed his ear to its case. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Deep, resonant, impossibly regular. But it had no mechanism he could see, no hands to mark the passage of the sound it was so clearly making. Part 2, Grandfather's Hour. Thomas, a rational man despite his artistic inclinations, tried to find a logical explanation. A hidden battery-operated movement? A sympathetic vibration from a neighboring building? He examined the master clock minutely. Nothing. It remained a beautiful, baffling enigma, silently, audibly, keeping its own counsel. The true strangeness began on the third night. Thomas had set up a small cot in the back room of the workshop, too broke for proper lodgings yet. Precisely at 1 o'clock in the morning, he was jolted awake. Not by the ticking, which had become a familiar background hum, but by a voice. "Remember the sparrows, Thomas. Kindness costs nothing." It was Grandfather Arthur's voice, unmistakable, warm and slightly raspy, just as he remembered it. It seemed to emanate directly from the master clock. Thomas sat bolt upright, heart hammering. He fumbled for the light. The workshop was empty. He crept towards the master clock. Silence, save for the steady tick-tock. Had he dreamt it? But at 2 o'clock, it happened again. Grandfather Arthur's voice, calm and clear, "A clean workbench is a clear mind, my boy." And at 3, "Measure twice, cut once." Applies to more than just brass, Thomas. Every hour, on the hour, a piece of his grandfather's wisdom, a familiar aphorism, a gentle admonishment. It was like the old man was still there, offering guidance from beyond the veil, his voice preserved somehow within the timeless wood of the master clock. Thomas felt a strange mix of comfort and profound unease. He wasn't just inheriting a workshop, he was inheriting a haunting, albeit a benevolent one. Part 3, The Unwinding of Shame. The hourly pronouncements continued, a nightly ritual. Thomas began to anticipate them, even find a strange solace in the familiar sound of his grandfather's voice. He was making progress with the business, restoring a few old mantel clocks for local customers, his skill slowly growing. Then, the nature of the master clock's hourly messages began to change. They became less about general wisdom and more personal. Uncomfortably so. One night, at 2 a.m., instead of a comforting platitude, the clock uttered, in his grandfather's disappointed tone, that little lie about the missing shilling, "Thomas. From Mrs. Gable's change. I knew. I always knew." Thomas froze. A childhood transgression, a tiny act of theft he'd long forgotten. Or suppressed. He'd been 7. The shame washed over him, fresh and acute. How could the clock know that? The following night, at 4 a.m., Sarah Albright. "You broke her heart, you know." A few kind words would have gone a long way. Sarah Albright had been his first girlfriend, a sweet girl he'd carelessly discarded when he'd left for university. The memory, unbidden, brought a pang of genuine regret. The master clock was no longer just a timekeeper or a dispenser of folksy wisdom. It had become a confessor, a repository of his past misdeeds, his hidden shames, his unacknowledged fears. Each hour, it would dredge up another forgotten moment, another uncomfortable truth, laying it bare in his grandfather's voice. Sleep became a torment of anxious anticipation. He tried covering the clock, stuffing its empty cavity with rags. But the voice, and the relentless tick-tock, always found its way out. Part 4, Time Made Real. The most terrifying aspect wasn't just the recounting of these shameful memories. It was what started happening after the clock spoke them. The morning after the clock mentioned the stolen shilling, Thomas found a small, tarnished shilling resting on his workbench, precisely where he kept his petty cash. It hadn't been there before. He picked it up, his hand trembling. It felt cold, old. A few days after the pronouncement about Sarah Albright, he received an email. From Sarah. The first contact in over 5 years. She was passing through Oakhaven, she wrote, and wondered if he might be free for a coffee, for old time's sake. Coincidence? Or was the clock not just remembering his past, but actively, impossibly, bringing elements of it back into his present? The incidents escalated. The clock mentioned a disastrous school play where he'd forgotten all his lines, causing widespread embarrassment. The next day, he stumbled upon an old, dusty program from that very play tucked inside a clock he was repairing, a play performed in a different town, decades ago. It spoke of his fear of heights, a secret he'd never shared. That afternoon, the ladder in the workshop inexplicably slipped while he was reaching for a high shelf, sending him tumbling, thankfully unhurt but badly shaken. The master clock wasn't just showing him his past, it was manifesting it, making his fears and regrets tangible, forcing him to confront them in the harsh light of reality. The workshop, once a place of potential, became a crucible of his own personal history, every tick of the handless clock a step closer to another uncomfortable reckoning. He felt trapped, his life being re-edited by an unseen, omniscient horologist. Part 5, Facing the Mechanism. Thomas knew he couldn't go on like this. He was becoming a wreck, terrified of what each new hour would bring, what forgotten shame or fear the clock would resurrect and unleash. He had to stop it. But how do you stop a clock with no mechanism, a voice with no speaker? One night, bracing himself, he decided to confront the master clock not as a passive listener, but as an horologist. If it had a voice, if it kept time, it must have some kind underscore of internal logic, some hidden core. He spent hours examining it, tapping its wood, listening to the quality of its tick, searching for any panel, any seam, any clue. Finally, just before 3 a.m., when he knew another painful memory was due, his fingers found it, a tiny, almost invisible catch hidden in the ornate carving at the clock's base. He pressed it. A small, previously unseen panel clicked open. Inside, nestled amongst ancient, dust-filled clockwork that looked too complex and too old to function, was a single, gleaming brass cylinder, slowly rotating. It was a phonograph cylinder, like those from the earliest days of sound recording. And etched onto its surface, in minute, precise grooves, were not musical notes, but what looked like memories, moments, a lifetime of experiences. His grandfather's life. His own. As the clock struck 3, the cylinder clicked, and his grandfather's voice emerged, not with a shame, but with a new pronouncement. The past shapes us, Thomas, but it doesn't have to define us. The hands are gone. You must set your own time now. And then, for the first time since he'd inherited the workshop, the steady tick-tock of the master clock faltered, and fell silent. The voice was gone. Thomas stared at the revealed mechanism, a sense of profound, weary understanding washing over him. His grandfather hadn't just left him a business, he'd left him a challenge, a bizarre, horological therapy. The clock hadn't been trying to torment him, but to force him to confront his past, to acknowledge it, and perhaps, to move beyond it. He never found out how the clock truly worked, how it accessed his memories, or manifested those strange coincidences. Some mysteries, he decided, were best left to time. He didn't destroy the cylinder. He carefully closed the panel. The master clock remained silent, but Thomas felt a shift within himself. The shame was still there, the regrets too, but they no longer held the same power. He had faced them. The next day, he called Sarah Albright and agreed to meet for coffee. He even found Mrs. Gable's address and mailed her an anonymous envelope containing a new shilling and a heartfelt, if belated, apology. The workshop in Oakhaven still ticked with the sound of mended time, but now, Thomas Finch was the one setting the pace, his own hands shaping his future, free from the hourly judgment of the clock without hands. Waiting Room. Part 1, Echoes Beneath Rome. The air in the forgotten tunnels beneath Rome was cool and damp, carrying the scent of old stone, stagnant water, and the faint, metallic tang of disuse. Marco Moretti, an urban history student with a fervent obsession for the city's lost subterranean pathways, felt more at home here than in the bustling streets above. His current project, tracing the rumored, uncompleted Linea Silenti, a phantom subway line begun in the fascist era and abandoned, its tunnels allegedly repurposed, forgotten, or simply sealed off. Armed with grainy archival maps, a powerful flashlight, and an unshakable curiosity, Marco navigated the labyrinthine service tunnels and disused sections of the operational metro. He was searching for a specific junction, a point marked on one particularly dubious 1930s schematic as a potential station hub for the Linea Silenti. Most academics dismissed it as fantasy, but Marco believed. Days of meticulous exploration led him to a section of tunnel that didn't quite align with modern metro maps. Behind a crumbling brick wall, clearly a later addition, he found it, not a grand station, but a narrow, unadorned passageway that sloped gently downwards. It was not on any official diagram he'd ever seen. His heart hammered with a thrill of discovery. He squeezed through the opening he'd made, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The passageway opened into a surprisingly large, rectangular space. It was a waiting room. Dust lay thick on the tiled floor, but otherwise, it was remarkably preserved. Rows of simple, sturdy wooden chairs faced a blank wall where a platform might have been. A faded timetable, its Italian still legible but for a line that didn't exist, clung to one wall. There was no track visible, just the blank wall. But the room was undeniably designed as a place for waiting. Part 2, The Ghost Amenities. Marco spent hours in the hidden waiting room, photographing, sketching, his excitement palpable. This was it, proof of the linea silenti's intended reach. He returned daily, carefully concealing his entry point, treating the space like his own secret archaeological dig. The strangeness began subtly. On his third visit, he noticed the chairs. They were still dusty, but somehow, neater. As if someone had straightened them since his last visit. He dismissed it. Perhaps vibrations from the active metro lines above had shifted them. Then came the newspapers. One morning, neatly folded on one of the chairs, was a copy of Il Messaggero. It was fresh, crisp, dated for that very day. Marco's blood ran cold. He hadn't brought it. There was no other access to this room that he knew of. He looked around wildly, calling out tentatively in Italian. Only silence answered, the profound, suffocating silence of buried places. He snatched up the paper, his hands trembling. It was real. The next day, the smell hit him the moment he entered the waiting room, the rich, unmistakable aroma of freshly brewed espresso. It was strong, inviting, making his mouth water. But there was no coffee machine, no vendor, nothing to explain it. The scent hung heavy in the air for an hour, then gradually faded, leaving only the usual damp, dusty smell. And then, the train. Sometimes, usually late in the day when he was packing up, he'd hear it, the distant, mournful horn of a train approaching, followed by the rumble of wheels on tracks. The sound would grow louder, seeming to come from beyond the blank wall where the platform should be, then fade away again, without ever arriving. He'd press his ear to the cold concrete, but feel no vibration, see no flicker of headlights through any imagined cracks. The linea silenti was silent, yet its ghost train still ran. Part 3, The Unseen Commuters. Marco's fascination warred with a growing unease. The waiting room was not just abandoned, it felt expectant. Occupied by unseen presences, maintained by invisible hands. He started leaving small items, a coin, a pen, to see if they'd be moved. They always were, subtly shifted, as if examined and then politely replaced. He tried to rationalize. Other urban explorers. Maintenance workers using a forgotten access point. But the sheer impossibility of fresh newspapers and the aroma of coffee in a sealed-off, dust-filled chamber defied logical explanation. He set up a small, motion-activated trail camera, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was tending to this spectral station. The camera captured nothing but hours of empty, dusty footage, though the newspapers continued to appear, the coffee sent to perfume the air, the phantom train to announce its non-arrival. He found himself spending more and more time in the waiting room, drawn by its mystery. He'd sit in one of the sturdy wooden chairs, reading the ghostly newspapers, the silence broken only by the imaginary train. It was peaceful, in a deeply unsettling way. He felt like he was intruding on a private, timeless ritual. One afternoon, exhausted from a long day of clambering through narrow tunnels, Marco sat in one of the chairs to rest, intending only to close his eyes for a moment. The familiar, faint rumble of the approaching phantom train was a distant lullaby. He drifted off to sleep. Part 4, The Full Carriage. He woke with a start, unsure how long he'd slept. The air in the waiting room felt different, thicker, warmer, charged with a subtle energy. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering from his still active headlamp, which had fallen to his chest. And then he saw them. Every single chair in the waiting room was occupied. Men in outdated but neat suits, women in simple dresses and hats that seemed to belong to the 1930s or 40s. They sat patiently, hands folded in their laps, some holding spectral, translucent versions of the newspapers he'd been finding. They were all looking at him. Not with hostility, but with a quiet, collective curiosity, their faces pale and indistinct, their eyes like shadows. Marco's heart leaped into his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. These were not living people. They were, the commuters. The ones who had been waiting for the linea silenti, perhaps for decades. A faint whisper, like dry leaves skittering across the floor, seemed to emanate from them, a chorus of hushed Italian. He couldn't make out the words, but the intent felt clear: you are in our space. You see us now. The smell of espresso was overwhelmingly strong. The mournful horn of the phantom train sounded, not distant this time, but deafeningly close, as if it were about to burst through the blank wall. The room seemed to vibrate. Marco scrambled up, knocking over his chair with a clatter that sounded obscenely loud in the charged silence. The figures didn't react, their shadowy eyes still fixed on him. He backed away slowly, towards the narrow passageway he'd entered through. "Scusate," he whispered, the apology feeling utterly inadequate. I didn't mean to disturb you." He turned and fled, stumbling through the passageway, bursting out from behind the crumbling brick wall into the relative normality of the disused utility tunnel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop running until he reached the surface, emerging blinking into the harsh Roman sunlight, the sounds and smells of the living city a shocking, welcome assault on his senses. Part 5, The Next Arrival. Marco never went back to the hidden waiting room. He sealed the opening in the brick wall himself, piling rubble against it, wanting to erase the memory, to pretend it had never happened. He tried to focus on other, more conventional aspects of his research, but the image of those patient, spectral commuters, their eyes fixed on him, was burned into his mind. He never told anyone the full story. Who would believe him? The forgotten waiting room, the fresh newspapers, the aroma of coffee, the train that never arrived, the silent, watching figures. It sounded like madness. But sometimes, late at night, when he was working on his thesis, he would hear it, the faint, distant horn of a train. And he would smell, just for a fleeting moment, the rich aroma of Italian espresso. Years later, a new generation of urban explorers, following whispers and fragmented online forum posts about a ghost station on a lost line, rediscovered the crumbling brick wall. They broke through. The passageway was still there. The waiting room beyond was dusty, silent. The chairs were neatly arranged. On one of them lay a fresh copy of Il Messaggero. And the air held the faint, lingering scent of strong coffee. They explored, took photos, marveled at the preservation. One of them, tired from the climb, sat down in a dusty chair to rest, remarking how peaceful it felt. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. The others didn't notice when he fell asleep. They didn't see the other chairs slowly, silently fill with pale, patient figures. They didn't hear the mournful horn of the approaching train, a train that had been waiting a very long time for its next passenger. The linea silenti always had room for one more.